At the edge of the high Andean plateau lies a lake so vast it seems more like an inland sea, suspended between mountains and clouds. Lake Titicaca has long been a mirror of enigmas, reflecting not only the peaks of the Cordillera Real, but also the shadows of forgotten stories. Here, in the thin air where breathing itself feels like a ritual, fragments of stone lie scattered in ways that seem to resist the ordinary logic of time. Myths whisper of cities now resting beneath the surface, temples of impossible precision, and civilizations erased as if by a deliberate hand. Some scholars point to Tiahuanaco, with its cyclopean blocks and celestial alignments, as a clue to a knowledge older than the Incas. Others speak of oral traditions passed down through Aymara and Quechua voices, which tell of floods, of vanished peoples, of gods who arrived not from the valleys, but from the sky or from beyond the horizon. Yet between myth and archaeology lies a field of silence, where every broken stone and sunken ruin seems to hold back an answer. What if the true story of these mountains and waters was not merely forgotten, but obscured, rewritten, or sealed away? What if beneath the cold waves of Titicaca rests not just myth, but memory, and Atlantis of the Andes hidden in plain sight? Welcome to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The winds sweep across the altiplano with a sound that is neither storm nor silence, but something between, a kind of breath that carries the weight of centuries. Travelers who come to Lake Titicaca often feel this first, the unsettling awareness that the lake is not just water, not just a body suspended in the Andes, but a vessel of memory. The question lingers. Why does this place evoke a sense of something hidden, something submerged in more than just the literal sense? Beneath the surface, legends rise like shifting shadows, and scholars, explorers, and mystics alike have all tried to decipher what remains of civilizations drowned by time. The Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century spoke of ruins already ancient, structures whose builders the local people could not fully name. They found temples that did not fit the Incan style, nor could they be explained as products of the people then living near the lake. One of these chroniclers, Pedro Chiesa de Leon, described enormous stones scattered across the plain near Tiahuanaco, carved with such exactness that they seemed to defy the tools available in pre-Columbian times. If the Incas themselves admitted these works were not theirs, then whose hands had once shaped these stones? The Incas said the site belonged to an earlier race, destroyed in floods and fire, swept away by forces that reconfigured the world. That theme, of a cataclysm erasing the memory of a people, echoes across so many traditions that it becomes impossible to ignore. In the Andean world, the myth of Viracocha tells of a creator god who rose from the waters of Lake Titicaca to bring order to a world cast into darkness. According to these accounts, he fashioned humanity, but when his first creations turned to violence, he drowned them in a flood and began again. What is striking here is not just the flood motif, familiar from Mesopotamian or biblical traditions, but the specific placement of this rebirth at Titicaca itself. Could this be more than allegory? Could the story be an encoded memory of a real disaster, an event that swallowed settlements whole beneath the waters of this vast, high-altitude lake? Archaeologists have long debated the origins of Tiahuanaco, a city whose age remains disputed. Some conventional estimates place its flourishing around 500 to 1000 CE, but older studies, influenced by archaeoastronomical alignments, suggested it could date back as far as 15,000 years. Arthur Posnansky, a controversial figure in early 20th century archaeology, argued that the city's structures aligned with constellations as they appeared in a distant epoch, long before recorded history. His claims have been largely rejected by mainstream scholarship, but they still haunt discussions of the site, like an echo that refuses to fade. If Posnansky was mistaken, why do so many stones at Tiahuanaco bear signs of advanced geometry, joins so precise that even a modern blade cannot pass between them, and channels carved as if by an understanding of hydraulics? These are not mere decorations. They suggest functions tied to water, ritual, or technology. And then there are the accounts of submerged ruins. In the 1960s, Jacques Cousteau conducted dives in Lake Titicaca. Though his team did not locate definitive lost cities, they reported strange formations and terraces beneath the surface, evidence that settlements once stood where now only fish and reeds move. Later expeditions confirmed walls and roads descending into the depths. Bolivian and Peruvian teams in the early 2000s discovered what some describe as a temple complex beneath the lake, stretching hundreds of meters, with carved stones that seemed deliberately placed. Such findings are often framed cautiously in academic terms. Perhaps they are merely remnants of shoreline structures overwhelmed by shifting water levels. Yet the image lingers. Stone steps leading downward into darkness, like paths into a sunken memory. If the waters rose, what caused it? Geological studies show that Lake Titicaca has not always been as it is now. The region experienced dramatic fluctuations in climate, with periods of desiccation when the lake nearly vanished, and others when melting glaciers swelled its boundaries. One hypothesis is that sudden glacial melt or tectonic shifts could have inundated settlements along its shore, leaving traces of a drowned world. The memory of such an event would live on in myth, transformed into stories of gods punishing humanity or of civilizations lost to divine wrath. But if the myths and ruins align, does that not suggest that behind the poetic veil lies a real cataclysm? The sense of deliberate erasure also arises. Spanish colonizers, upon encountering the stories of Viracocha and the immense ruins, often dismissed them as pagan distortions or attempted to fold them into Christian narratives. In doing so, they helped obscure the full weight of local memory. But even before the Spanish, the Incas themselves had taken control of the sacred landscape, weaving the lake and its islands into their imperial mythology. The Island of the Sun, for example, was claimed as the birthplace of the Inca dynasty, a recentering of myth to legitimize their power. In this way, memory was reshaped, directed, rewritten. If older civilizations had indeed vanished beneath the lake, their story was now filtered through layers of political and spiritual appropriation. So we arrive at a crossroads of interpretation. On one side, a purely material explanation: climate change, shifting water levels, natural disaster. On the other, a darker possibility: that memory itself has been manipulated, that fragments of a civilization were not only lost to nature, but deliberately obscured by those who came later. Which interpretation holds more weight? Is it enough to explain away the sunken walls as drowned terraces? Or do we also have to reckon with the silence, the way entire narratives vanish, leaving only hints in stone and story? The lake remains inscrutable. Its waters reflect the sky so perfectly that horizon disappears, blurring the boundary between above and below. Perhaps this is why myths persist. The lake itself becomes a metaphor for memory, hiding as much as it reveals. What lies beneath cannot be seen directly, only guessed at through distortions and fragments. And yet the fragments remain stubborn, refusing to dissolve into forgetfulness. If we stand at the shore, watching the ripples spread across the surface, we might wonder, how many civilizations must vanish before history itself becomes unreliable? How many times has memory been rewritten, recast, reinterpreted? And beneath the stillness of Titicaca, what echoes are still waiting to rise again, unbidden, to remind us that forgetting is never complete? The question remains suspended, like the lake itself, caught between the mountains and the sky. The lake's silence has always been deceptive. What seems like calm is in truth a veil, and beneath that veil lies a weight of unanswered questions. One of the most unsettling of these questions begins not with the ruins beneath the water, but with the stones that lie scattered across the altiplano like fragments of a dream interrupted. Tiahuanaco, with its monolithic gateways and precision-cut blocks, continues to provoke both fascination and discomfort. The discomfort arises from the fact that the deeper one looks, the more the site seems to resist easy categorization. If the city truly flourished only 1,000 years ago, why do so many of its features appear to belong to something far older, or at least informed by knowledge strangely out of place in its time? Consider the Gate of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite weighing many tons. Its surface holds an intricate frieze, dominated by a central figure often identified with Viracocha, surrounded by rows of winged beings. The precision of the carving suggests not only advanced tools, but also a cosmology embedded into architecture. Archaeoastronomers have noted possible alignments between the gate and celestial events, as though it functioned not merely as an entryway, but as a kind of cosmic calendar. Yet mainstream accounts often retreat from these possibilities, preferring to frame the gate as symbolic or ceremonial. But if it was only symbolic, why construct it with such mathematical precision? Why orient it to the heavens with such care? The question persists, and with it, the unease that something in the official narrative remains incomplete. The very stones of Tiahuanaco pose similar puzzles. Many blocks show a level of refinement in their joins that suggests techniques far beyond simple hammer and chisel. Some researchers point to the mysterious H-blocks found at Puma Punku, a site associated with Tiahuanaco. Each block, shaped with deep recesses and sharp right angles, appears to have been cut to fit with others in modular fashion, almost like components of an advanced system. Archaeologists argue these were simply the product of highly skilled masons using stone tools and patience, but others question whether such complexity could emerge in isolation without metal tools or written records of construction. The silence of history only deepens the riddle. How did this knowledge appear, and why did it vanish without trace? Here enters the possibility of memory distortion, not merely by time, but by intentional reshaping. When the Spanish encountered the ruins, they filtered what they saw through the lens of their own worldview. To them, the myths of Viracocha or sunken cities could only be understood as echoes of biblical stories or dismissed entirely as superstition. But the Incas themselves had already woven Tiahuanaco into their imperial fabric, claiming it as a place of origin, a link between their dynasty and divine will. In this way, the ruins became a contested landscape. Each empire, each worldview, reshaped its story to serve its own authority. Could this layering of interpretations be one reason why the site's true origins remain obscured? Perhaps the act of rewriting history is not just accidental, but systemic. A pattern repeating across ages, leaving behind only fragments that no one can fully piece together. The role of water remains haunting. Many features at Puma Punku appear to incorporate channels, drains, and reservoirs, suggesting the structures were not merely ceremonial, but functional, tied to the control or ritual use of water. Some have speculated they formed part of a sophisticated hydraulic system. Others see them as evidence of a cosmology in which water was the conduit between worlds, the earthly and the divine. If the lake itself was the axis of creation myths, then a city engineered with water at its heart may have been a reflection of that myth made stone. And if the rising waters of Titicaca later drowned parts of these settlements, the myth of a world destroyed by flood gains a chillingly literal dimension. Expeditions into the lake in the late 20th and early 21st centuries continued to report submerged walls, terraces, and steps. Some of these could be explained as natural formations or as the remains of shoreline villages gradually overtaken by shifting levels. Yet others, such as the so-called temple complex, discovered in 2000, resist dismissal. Reports described a massive structure extending over a kilometer, with features resembling roads and plazas, all beneath the waves. Though still debated, the very existence of such findings fuels the question: what if Titicaca's myths preserve the memory of cities that once stood proud on its shores, only to be engulfed and forgotten? The locals themselves never doubted that the lake held secrets. Oral traditions speak of spirits and cities beneath the water, voices that can sometimes be heard when the wind is still. Fishermen tell of stones that glimmer in the depths and of shapes too regular to be natural. For them, the idea of an Atlantis of the Andes is not a fanciful projection, but a living memory, one passed down as truth, even when written records are absent. This tension between oral tradition and academic skepticism creates yet another layer of silence, an unwillingness to accept that memory may hold truths that scholarship cannot easily measure. And perhaps it is this very unwillingness that haunts the study of Titicaca. The silence around the ruins may not be accidental at all. It could be the product of centuries of dismissal, appropriation, and control. Each empire, each order of knowledge, sought to redefine the meaning of these stones and waters until the original voices were drowned. Yet the stones remain, stubborn, heavy, impossible to ignore. And the lake continues to conceal its secrets, offering only glimpses when divers descend or when drought lowers the waters to reveal terraces that had long been hidden. So we circle back to the unanswered question: were these ruins the work of a civilization we already know, or of one erased so thoroughly that only stone and myth survived? If it was the former, then why does the narrative still feel fractured, incomplete, punctured by gaps? If it was the latter, then what does it mean for our understanding of history itself, that civilizations of such scale and knowledge could vanish, leaving us with only rumors and ruins. Standing on the edge of the water, the wind in the reeds, one might imagine the city that once was, with its plazas and temples alive with sound. And then imagine the sudden silence, the flood or the collapse that pulled it beneath the waves. How fragile is civilization, that what stands today may tomorrow be only myth. And how fragile is memory, that the truth of a people can be rewritten until only fragments remain. The lake does not answer. It only reflects. And in that reflection, we are left to wonder. Is history itself just the surface, while the deeper truths remain submerged, waiting for the moment when someone dares to dive deeper? There are places in the world where time seems to collapse, where past and present intertwine, until one can no longer distinguish which is shadow and which is substance. The shores of Lake Titicaca are such a place. When the morning light strikes the surface, the water turns into a mirror that reflects not only the surrounding mountains, but the possibility of entire histories submerged beneath its depths. Fishermen set out in reed boats, their movements timeless, and yet their very presence becomes a reminder of continuity and a landscape scarred by discontinuity. For here, at the crossroads of myth and archaeology, we encounter a riddle that refuses to be neatly solved. The question that presses hardest is not only who built the monumental ruins of Tiahuanaco and Puma Punku, but why their story is fractured, scattered in fragments rather than preserved in a coherent tradition. The Incas who inherited this land claimed descent from the lake and its islands, yet they admitted openly that the great stones predated them. Spanish chroniclers recorded the same confession, that even the powerful Inca rulers stood in awe before ruins they could not claim as their own. This acknowledgement alone suggests the existence of an older order, one powerful enough to shape the sacred landscape, but fragile enough to disappear almost without trace. Scholars have debated whether the builders were simply ancestors of later Andean peoples, their legacy magnified by the passage of time. Yet there are details that resist such simplicity. The modular precision of Puma Punku's H-blocks, for instance, suggests an architectural vision beyond immediate necessity. Why craft blocks so intricate, so finely cut, if the sole purpose was ritual display? The suggestion arises that these blocks were part of a system, perhaps structural, perhaps symbolic, but in either case pointing to knowledge not fully understood by those who inherited them. And if such knowledge existed, why does it vanish from the record so abruptly, leaving no gradual line of evolution to connect the past with the present? Part of the mystery lies not only in stone, but in the myths themselves. The figure of Viracocha, emerging from the waters to recreate humanity after a flood, resonates across Andean traditions. Some versions tell of his departure across the sea, vanishing into the horizon, leaving behind temples and teachings. Others describe him as a bringer of order, light, and civilization, appearing at a time when the world was engulfed in darkness and chaos. To hear these myths is to sense that they are more than allegories. They carry the weight of a remembered rupture, a before and after marked by destruction and renewal. Could these stories encode the memory of a disaster so profound it reshaped both land and memory? Flood myths are not unique to the Andes, but their persistence in cultures worldwide suggests a shared human experience of catastrophe, geological evidence shows that Lake Titicaca has indeed swelled and receded dramatically throughout its history, alternately shrinking into salt flats and rising into a vast inland sea. A sudden inundation, perhaps triggered by glacial melt at the end of the last ice age, could have drowned settlements and driven survivors to higher ground. For those who lived through it, the event would have seemed nothing less than apocalyptic. In retelling the story, generation after generation may have transformed lived trauma into myth, encoding memory in the only way available to oral tradition. Yet myths alone do not explain the precision of the stones, the astronomical alignments, the hydraulic systems. These features suggest not just survival, but a sophisticated relationship with environment and cosmos. At Tiahuanaco, some structures appear aligned to solstices and equinoxes, indicating a culture attuned to the movements of the heavens. The Kalasasaya temple, with its vast courtyard and stone pillars, may have functioned as an observatory, tracking celestial cycles with a precision that would be difficult to achieve without long-term observation and mathematical understanding. What does it mean that such achievements exist in a place whose history is otherwise fragmented, whose story is drowned in silence? The silence itself becomes suspicious. When civilizations fall, they often leave behind layers of continuity, languages that evolve, traditions that adapt, knowledge that mutates but doesn't vanish entirely. Here, however, there is rupture. We see monumental architecture of startling refinement, followed by absence, followed by the rise of new cultures that revere but cannot fully explain what came before. This pattern raises uncomfortable questions. Was the knowledge deliberately suppressed? Was there a systematic erasure, whether by natural disaster, by conquest, or by the slow violence of cultural appropriation? When the Spanish arrived, they imposed their own erasure, reinterpreting Viracocha as a distorted anticipation of the Christian God, dismissing other aspects of the myth as pagan fabrication. In doing so, they severed the connection between memory and meaning, leaving only fragments that could survive in whispers. But the Incas, too, had reshaped the past, claiming sacred sites as their own origins, weaving them into imperial myth. Layer by layer, memory was rewritten, until what remains is less a story than a palimpsest, each new power inscribing itself over what came before. How, then, can one hope to recover the truth when each telling has been filtered, each stone interpreted anew to serve the needs of those who claim it? Perhaps the answer does not lie in recovering a single truth, but in recognizing the pattern of loss itself. The ruins are not only monuments to an ancient people, they are also monuments to the fragility of memory, to the way civilizations rise and fall not only in stone, but in story. The submerged temples of Titicaca, the carved gates of Tiahuanaco, the myths of Viracocha, they all point not only to what once was, but to how easily knowledge slips beneath the surface, concealed by waters both literal and symbolic. And yet, there is something stubborn in stone. No matter how many narratives seek to reshape it, the physical weight remains, challenging the silence. The stones cannot be dismissed, nor can the myths that cling to them. They force us to ask, what if the official history, the tidy timelines of archaeology, are themselves part of the veil? What if the fragments we hold are not anomalies, but warnings, signals from a past we have chosen not to hear? The lake answers with reflection, not with speech. And in that reflection, one sees not only mountains and clouds, but the outline of questions unasked. What other cities have been drowned in silence? What other memories lie submerged, waiting for the moment when the veil thins and the truth rises, if only for an instant before sinking again? The air around Lake Titicaca carries a stillness that is never truly empty. At dusk, when the sun sinks behind the Cordillera peaks and the water glows like molten bronze, the silence feels alive, as though it holds voices long forgotten. It is here that ancient memory collides with present uncertainty, a threshold where the visible and the invisible overlap. To walk among the ruins of Tiahuanaco or stand upon the floating islands is to sense that history has not been lost so much as concealed, awaiting the moment when fragments emerge like shadows breaking through mist. One of the most compelling aspects of the Titicaca mystery lies in the question of origin. If these monumental sites predate the Incas, who then conceived them? And why does the cultural line leading to them seem so faint, almost erased? Scholars point to the Tiahuanacu culture, known to have flourished in the first millennium CE, whose art and artifacts suggest a sophisticated society deeply attuned to agriculture, astronomy, and ritual. But even within this framework, anomalies persist. The scale of the stones at Puma Punku, weighing hundreds of tons, challenges the logistical capacity of such a society. Without wheels, without beasts of burden strong enough to transport them across miles of rugged landscape, how were they moved, set, and aligned with such uncanny precision? The debate grows sharper when we consider that some blocks seem quarried from sources many kilometers away. The question of transportation is not merely technical, but philosophical. If they achieved such feats, what kind of knowledge did they possess that modern narratives now deny them? Or has our own vision of the past become so filtered by assumptions of linear progress that we cannot imagine a different trajectory of skill and intelligence, one that rose and fell without leaving behind a neat trail of continuity? The myths complicate matters further. Viracocha, the great creator, emerges from the waters only to vanish again across the sea, a figure at once benevolent and destructive. His flood is said to have swept away a race of giants, leaving behind scattered ruins as warning and reminder. These stories are not unique to the Andes. Floods, giants, creators, and vanishing gods echo in traditions from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. Could these parallels be coincidence, or do they hint at a shared ancient memory, a catastrophe so vast that it left imprints on cultures separated by oceans? There is also the recurring theme of knowledge granted and then withdrawn. Some versions of the Andean myths suggest Viracocha bestowed teachings of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy before departing, leaving humanity to preserve what fragments it could. If so, the ruins may be less the product of gradual invention and more the remnants of a gift, knowledge received, partially applied, and then fractured by disaster or neglect. If the gift was real, what does it mean that it wasn't carried forward, that it slipped into silence until only the stones could testify? Modern explorations deepen rather than resolve the mystery. In 2000, a Bolivian-Peruvian team of divers reported finding a structure beneath Lake Titicaca, described as a temple complex with terraces, walls, and roads extending across vast stretches of the lakebed. Some archaeologists interpret this as evidence of settlements drowned by fluctuating water levels, a reminder of how climate and geology shape human destiny. Others see in it confirmation of the legends, a city submerged in the very waters from which creation myths claim humanity was reborn. Either way, the discovery complicates the narrative. If such a city once stood, why did it vanish so completely from recorded memory, surviving only in myth? The possibility of erasure cannot be ignored. Empires consolidate power not only by conquering land, but also by rewriting memory. The Incas absorbed the ruins into their own cosmology, declaring Lake Titicaca the birthplace of their divine ancestors. The Spanish then arrived and reframed the myths once again, insisting that Viracocha was a distortion of the Christian God, that the flood was merely a pagan echo of Noah's Ark. Each retelling stripped layers of authenticity from the original voices, until what remained was less truth than appropriation. If we view history only through the accounts of conquerors, perhaps the silence around these ruins is not accidental, but engineered, a deliberate drowning of alternative narratives. Yet the stones resist. Their weight is their testimony. The H-blocks of Puma Punku, the Gateway of the Sun, the precision-drilled holes and carved channels, these are not inventions of imagination, but realities cut into andesite and sandstone. To dismiss them as anomalies is to ignore the material stubbornness of evidence. And so the debate persists, oscillating between two poles, one that explains the ruins as the peak of a known culture, and another that sees them as remnants of something older, larger, and deliberately forgotten. Neither position can fully dissolve the unease, because both leave questions unanswered. It is this unease that lingers when one stands at the lake's edge. The water is vast, its surface restless, and beneath it lies a darkness that swallows light as swiftly as it swallows memory. Divers return with reports of walls and steps, yet definitive answers slip away, distorted by silt and depth. The more one searches, the more the silence thickens, as though the lake itself conspires to guard what lies below. The paradox is stark. History demands clarity, yet what endures here is obscurity. Perhaps this is not failure, but design. Perhaps memory is not meant to be preserved in its entirety, but fractured, so that each generation must confront the mystery anew. What if the value of these ruins lies not in the answers they give, but in the questions they compel us to ask? What if the silence of Lake Titicaca is not an absence, but a form of instruction, urging us to look at history not as a straight line, but as a series of ruptures, erasures, and veiled returns? In the fading light, the lake reflects the mountains, the sky, and the first stars of evening. One sees both the vastness of the cosmos and the fragility of human presence. Civilizations rise, build, and vanish, leaving behind only fragments that future eyes may struggle to interpret. And yet, even in their disappearance, they leave an imprint, a resonance that compels us to remember what we cannot fully know. Perhaps that is the essence of the Atlantis of the Andes, not a city to be rediscovered in stone, but a reminder that forgetting itself is never absolute. Something always remains, waiting, submerged, whispering through silence. The plateau surrounding Lake Titicaca carries with it a strange paradox. It is both an emptiness and a fullness. The wide, barren spaces stretch to horizons that seem eternal, yet within those spaces lie fragments of civilizations that hint at a past too dense, too layered to have truly vanished. The altiplano feels less like a desert of memory and more like a vault, a landscape storing secrets in its stones, terraces, and waters. To walk here is to feel the pressure of what has been buried, submerged not only by time, but by the deliberate forgetting of history itself. Among the most striking enigmas are the agricultural terraces that rise along the slopes surrounding the lake. Their geometry is elegant, cascading bands of earth and stone carved with a logic both aesthetic and practical. Scholars agree that these terraces, some still in use today, reveal an advanced understanding of microclimates, irrigation, and soil preservation. They allowed crops to flourish in an environment often hostile to agriculture, where frost and drought constantly threatened survival. But the sheer scale of the system raises an unsettling question. Was this knowledge the legacy of one culture alone? Or was it inherited, modified, and passed down from an even older order now lost? The possibility that the terraces we see are only the remnants of a far greater system, partially erased, cannot be dismissed. It is here that the myths of submerged cities become less fanciful and more tangible. If entire agricultural systems could be drowned by rising waters, if terraces once vital could vanish beneath the lake's shifting levels, then why not temples, plazas, and settlements? Geological studies confirm that Titicaca has swelled and receded dramatically over millennia, at times transforming from fertile basin to desolate salt flats, and at others expanding to flood entire valleys. Each fluctuation would have reshaped human life, swallowing some communities while offering survival to others. In such upheaval, stories of floods, of gods erasing failed creations, begin to sound less like allegory and more like memory. Even today, the lake offers glimpses of its hidden depths. In seasons of drought, when waters recede, fishermen and villagers report seeing walls, steps, or stone alignments emerging briefly before being claimed again by the waves. Some describe hearing strange echoes beneath the surface, as though the lake amplifies not only sound, but memory itself. These testimonies are often dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, yet they persist with remarkable consistency, suggesting a cultural memory too vivid to be dismissed as invention. The very act of repeating these tales keeps alive the suspicion that beneath the lake lies something more than sediment and silt. Archaeological expeditions have found scattered confirmation of such suspicions. Submerged walls, terraces, and roads documented by divers in the late 20th century challenge the assumption that the lake has always been static. The 2000 discovery of what was described as a vast temple complex beneath the waters remains one of the most provocative finds. Though interpretation of the site remains contested, its existence alone adds weight to the idea that the myths of drowned cities may hold historical truth. If a civilization once thrived here, only to be consumed by shifting waters, then the memory encoded in myth is not mere imagination, but testimony. Yet the deeper puzzle lies in the discontinuity of knowledge. If these submerged ruins belonged to a people who mastered hydraulics, astronomy, and architecture, why does the line of transmission break so suddenly? Why do later cultures inherit fragments but not the whole, reverence but not clarity? This rupture suggests more than natural disaster. It suggests an erasure of memory itself. Civilizations can vanish physically, but for their knowledge to vanish so completely, something more must intervene. Either the collapse was so total that transmission was impossible, or subsequent powers deliberately obscured and reshaped the past. The Incas, in their rise, absorbed the sacred geography of Titicaca into their own mythology. They claimed the island of the sun as their birthplace, appropriating its power to legitimize their empire. The Spanish followed, layering over the Incas their own interpretations, mapping Christian narratives onto indigenous myths. Each layer of conquest brought with it a rewriting of memory, until the oldest voices were muffled beneath competing claims. What remains now is a palimpsest, fragments of truth hidden beneath centuries of narrative reconstruction. To peel away these layers is nearly impossible, for each one is both destruction and preservation, concealing while inadvertently carrying forward what it sought to erase. The result is a landscape of unresolved tension. On one hand, the academic insistence on cautious interpretation, framing the ruins and myths within known timelines. On the other, the persistent weight of anomalies, precision stones that defy tools, myths that echo global catastrophes, submerged ruins that resist dismissal. Between these poles lies silence, the silence of what has not been explained, of what has been deliberately forgotten, of what remains hidden beneath both water and narrative. It is within this silence that the mystery of the Andes Atlantis resides. To stand on the shores of Titicaca is to stand between worlds. The water reflects the heavens, blurring the line between earth and sky, past and present. One feels that the lake itself is a mirror not of what is, but of what has been concealed. The myths whisper of gods who rose from its depths, of civilizations erased, of teachings given and then withdrawn. The stones testify to knowledge both profound and fractured. The terraces remind us of survival, ingenuity, and the fragility of memory. And the waters themselves, dark and impenetrable, hold what no eye has yet clearly seen. If Atlantis was ever real, perhaps it does not lie beneath distant oceans, but here, high in the Andes, hidden not by waves but by silence, by rewriting, by the fragility of memory. Perhaps the true Atlantis is not a single city, but every civilization that has been swallowed, by water, by conquest, by the deliberate erasures of those who came after. And if that is the case, then the ruins of Titicaca are not merely remnants of the past, but warnings. They remind us that what we call history may be only the surface, and that beneath it lies a vastness of forgotten worlds, drowned not in water alone, but in silence. The question remains suspended in the thin air of the altiplano. How much of human memory has been erased, and how much waits, submerged, for the moment when the lake of history recedes and reveals what it has kept hidden? The high Andean winds whisper across the desolate plains, carrying with them the taste of salt, stone, and memory. Here, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, where air thins and breath feels borrowed, the landscape itself becomes a paradox. Barren, yet fertile with secrets, silent, yet heavy with echoes. It is in this suspended world, balanced between sky and earth, that one finds not only Lake Titicaca's shimmering expanse, but the ruins and myths that cling to its shores like fragments of a dream that refuses to fade. If we listen closely to these fragments, we find not a single narrative, but a web of contradictions. Tiahuanaco, for instance, is described by some scholars as the center of the Tiahuanacu culture, flourishing between 500 and 1000 CE. Yet its massive stones and precise engineering suggest something deeper, something that stretches beyond conventional timelines. The Gate of the Sun stands not as a ruin of a single culture, but as a cipher. Its carvings depict a figure believed to be Viracocha, surrounded by symbols that scholars debate endlessly. Was it a calendar, a cosmic code, or a mythological tableau? Each interpretation reveals something, but none dissolves the unease of incompleteness. The unease grows when we consider the astronomical alignments. The Kalasasaya temple, with its rows of stone pillars, seems positioned to mark solstices and equinoxes, functioning as an observatory of remarkable sophistication. For the people of the high plateau, the heavens were not distant, but immediate, their cycles tied to survival itself. Agricultural success depended on knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for frost. Yet the precision found here feels excessive if meant only for survival. It carries the imprint of a cosmology that sought to bind human life to the very architecture of the sky. Such ambition suggests more than practical knowledge. It suggests a worldview in which Earth and cosmos were inseparably fused. This worldview is echoed in the myths. Viracocha, emerging from the waters to reshape humanity, is not simply a creator, but a restorer. A figure tied to cycles of destruction and renewal. His flood sweeps away corrupted beings, leaving behind ruins and silence, and from that silence, new life is fashioned. One hears in this myth not just a metaphor, but perhaps a memory. The remembrance of a flood that erased entire settlements, a disaster so profound that it became etched into story. And where does Viracocha emerge? From Lake Titicaca itself, the very body of water that conceals submerged walls and terraces reported by divers centuries later. Myth and archaeology collide here, not neatly, but with unsettling resonance. The question that arises is whether these myths and ruins point to a forgotten chapter in human history, one too fragile to survive intact. If so, why is its memory so fragmented, its transmission so broken? When we look at the ruins, we see mastery of stonework, of hydraulics, of astronomy. But when we look at the cultural record, we see silence, gaps, and ruptures. Civilizations that followed revered the sites, but could not reproduce their knowledge. The Incas, powerful and innovative in their own right, admitted that the builders were not of their time. The Spanish dismissed the ruins as pagan relics, overlaying them with biblical interpretations. At each step, voices were lost, narratives rewritten, memory eroded. Some researchers have suggested that the break in transmission was due to catastrophe, natural or otherwise. Geological studies of the region confirm that Titicaca's water levels have fluctuated violently across millennia. Entire valleys once fertile became salt flats. Other regions were drowned beneath rising waters. A sudden surge could have erased settlements, leaving behind myths of floods and gods punishing humanity. But catastrophe alone does not explain why knowledge itself vanished so thoroughly. If survivors remained, why was so much forgotten? Could it be that disaster struck not only the land, but the structure of memory itself, severing the chain of continuity? Others have argued that the silence was imposed, that history was not merely forgotten but actively obscured. Conquerors, whether Inca or Spanish, had little incentive to preserve the truths of those who came before, if those truths undermined their authority. Instead, they rewrote memory to suit their own ends, absorbing sacred geography into their cosmologies, reframing myths to legitimize their rule. The lake became the Inca cradle of creation, the island of the sun, their divine birthplace. The Spanish, unwilling to entertain indigenous narratives on their own terms, rebranded Viracocha as a distorted Christ figure. In this way, memory was overwritten, layer by layer, until the original voices were no longer audible. What remains are fragments, stones, myths, echoes that resist erasure but cannot speak plainly. The submerged ruins discovered by divers at the turn of the millennium stand as physical challenges to this silence. A complex of walls, terraces, and pathways was documented beneath the waters, stretching across distances that suggest more than scattered villages. The existence of such structures raises new questions. Who built them? When? And under what conditions? Were they drowned gradually, victims of a slowly rising lake, or suddenly in a cataclysm that shattered continuity? For now, the answers remain elusive, submerged as deeply as the ruins themselves. Perhaps this is the lesson of Titicaca, that history is not a seamless progression, but a series of ruptures. Civilizations rise, flourish, collapse, and are buried, leaving behind fragments that defy neat explanation. The fragments are all we have, and they force us to question whether the narrative we call history is itself only a surface layer, a reflection shimmering above deeper truths. If Atlantis existed, perhaps it was not a single city lost to the sea, but a pattern, a recurring erasure that haunts humanity, reappearing in myths across continents, always pointing to the fragility of memory and the impermanence of power. Standing at the lake's shore, watching the stars gather over the mountains, one feels both awe and unease. The water mirrors the heavens, and in that mirror lies a reminder. Civilizations are as fragile as reflections, beautiful yet easily shattered. The ruins, the myths, the submerged stones, they do not provide closure, only questions, and perhaps that is their true power. For in the questions themselves lies a challenge, to confront the possibility that what has been forgotten may be greater than what we remember, and that history, as we know it, may be only the thinnest crust over a vast abyss of silence. The wind stirs the reeds, the lake glimmers with reflected starlight, and the silence deepens. Somewhere beneath those dark waters lies a city, or a memory of one, waiting for the day when the veil thins and the forgotten rises again. Until then, all that remains is the question: how much of the past have we lost, and how much still waits, unseen, beneath the surface? The altiplano at night becomes a world of silence and stars. Under the thin atmosphere, the constellations blaze with a clarity unfamiliar to those who dwell at lower altitudes. The Milky Way arches overhead like a celestial river, and for the peoples of the Andes, this vision was never just beauty, but knowledge. They saw in the night sky not only hunters and animals, but rivers, llamas, and paths of creation. To them, the heavens were a mirror of the earth, a reflection so precise that one could not separate human destiny from celestial rhythm. It is here, in this intertwining of sky and land, that we begin to glimpse another layer of the mystery surrounding Lake Titicaca and the ruins that cling to its shores. The builders of Tiahuanaco and Puma Punku did not carve their monuments in isolation. They placed them within a sacred geography, one that stretched from mountain peaks to lake waters to constellations. The gateway of the sun, with its intricate carvings, may have served as more than a ceremonial passage. Some scholars propose it functioned as a marker of time, its symbols tied to solar cycles. The Kalasasaya temple, oriented to solstices, suggests that entire structures were designed to synchronize human ritual with cosmic motion. Even the placement of Puma Punku, with its enigmatic H-blocks, may not have been random, but aligned to celestial or geographic features. These alignments speak of a worldview in which architecture was cosmology and stone was scripture. Yet as compelling as these alignments are, they carry with them a haunting question. Why would such a sophisticated system collapse into silence? If these people could measure the heavens, master hydraulic engineering, and transport immense blocks of stone, why did their knowledge vanish so abruptly? The ruins suggest mastery, but the memory is fractured, handed down only in fragments, reframed by Incas and Spaniards, never fully preserved. This discontinuity troubles not only historians but philosophers. It suggests that civilizations can rise to astonishing heights and yet be erased almost completely, their memory submerged like the drowned ruins beneath Titicaca's waters. The myths preserve only fragments. Viracocha, emerging from the lake, reshaping humanity, vanishing across the sea. His story resonates with other global myths of gods or culture bringers who arrive, bestow knowledge, and then disappear. Some interpretations frame Viracocha not as a deity, but as the memory of ancient teachers, bearers of wisdom from an earlier age. If so, then perhaps the ruins of Tiahuanaco are not merely the product of isolated development, but of an inheritance, a legacy half remembered. Yet this inheritance was fragile. It fractured under the weight of catastrophe, leaving behind only the stone and the myth. Geological studies reveal that the Andes are a land of upheaval. Tectonic forces continue to shape the altiplano. Earthquakes shake the mountains, glaciers advance and retreat. For those who lived here millennia ago, survival required adaptation to cycles of instability. A sudden flood, a prolonged drought, a shift in climate could erase not only settlements, but the continuity of knowledge itself. Oral traditions may preserve memory of disaster, but oral traditions are also malleable, reshaped with each telling. The myth of Viracocha's flood may encode memory of a real cataclysm, but in becoming myth it also became untethered, its details softened, its meaning reframed. What remains is a truth both preserved and concealed. This concealment may not have been accidental. The Incas, upon absorbing Tiahuanaco into their empire, rebranded it as a sacred origin, weaving its ruins into their own story of divine ancestry. The Spanish, arriving later, dismantled not only temples but memory itself, forcing indigenous narratives into biblical frameworks. In this process, truths were not merely forgotten, but actively overwritten. The silence of the ruins is thus twofold: one silence born of time and catastrophe, another imposed by conquest and narrative control. To listen to the stones is to hear not absence, but layers of erasure. And yet, anomalies persist. In 2000, the discovery of a massive submerged structure in Lake Titicaca reawakened speculation that myths of drowned cities might have factual basis. The reported temple complex, extending over a kilometer, suggests a scale of construction difficult to dismiss as mere shoreline settlements overtaken by rising waters. Whether this was the heart of a forgotten city or a ceremonial center now drowned, its existence deepens the enigma. Why has such a discovery not transformed our understanding of Andean history? Why does it remain on the margins, treated as an anomaly rather than a revelation? perhaps because to accept it would demand rewriting history once again, and the guardians of official narratives preferred the stability of silence. This preference for silence mirrors the silence of the lake itself. Titicaca does not reveal its depths easily. Its waters are opaque, concealing what lies beneath, offering only fragments to divers and explorers. In this way, the lake becomes both metaphor and reality, a surface that reflects the sky while concealing the depths, a reminder that what is visible is never the whole. History, too, reflects only part of reality, concealing as much as it reveals. The ruins, myths, and submerged structures remind us that the official record is at best incomplete, at worst deliberately distorted. The question remains whether this Atlantis of the Andes was truly a single city, or whether it is an idea, a symbol of every civilization lost to water, conquest, or silence. Perhaps the myth is not about one location, but about a pattern repeated across human history, cultures rising to heights of knowledge and power, only to vanish, leaving behind fragments that confuse as much as they reveal. If so, Lake Titicaca becomes more than a geographic site. It becomes an allegory for memory itself, vast, reflective, concealing, refusing to surrender its full truth. The night deepens, the stars thicken overhead, and the lake lies black and still. In its surface, one sees constellations mirrored as though the heavens themselves have sunk into the water. The ruins on its shore stand mute, their stones heavy with meanings no longer spoken. The myths echo faintly, half-remembered, reframed, distorted. And between these fragments lies silence, a silence that is itself a form of testimony. For in the silence we are forced to confront not only what has been lost, but what may never be recovered. Perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of the Andes Atlantis. That history is not only about remembering, but about forgetting. And that what we forget may be greater, deeper, and more transformative than what we preserve. The ruins, the lake, the myths, they remind us that civilization itself is fragile, that knowledge can vanish as easily as breath in the thin Andean air. And they leave us with questions that cannot be silenced. How many times has humanity risen and fallen? How many times has memory been erased? And how much of the truth still lies waiting, submerged beneath the waters of time? Dawn arrives slowly on the high plateau, spilling light across the vast plain until the mountains ignite in pale fire. Lake Titicaca, at this hour, is no longer bronze or black, but silver, a reflective skin stretched thin between heaven and earth. To those who rise with the sun, it is easy to imagine why generations believed this water to be sacred. Its surface captures not just light, but memory, a shifting mirror of what has been and what has been lost. And with each sunrise, the question renews itself. What lies beneath, hidden from both eye and history? When we turn again to the ruins at Tiahuanaco, the mystery grows heavier. The scale of construction here is unsettling in its ambition. Monoliths weigh dozens, even hundreds of tons, transported from quarries miles away. The exactness of their joins, the geometric perfection of cut and angle, remains difficult to explain with the tools known to have been available. Archaeologists, cautious and pragmatic, argue that skill, labor, and patience account for the achievements. Yet the unease persists. Why do these stones seem to exceed the needs of ritual? Why build so massively, so meticulously, only to abandon it all? The silence that follows the question feels like an answer in itself, one that resists the tidy comfort of conventional history. Among the most evocative features are the so-called H-blocks of Puma Punku. These intricately carved stones appear modular, as though part of a larger system, a construction set of astonishing refinement. Their precision has led some to argue they reflect an advanced technology, perhaps even a knowledge lost to subsequent generations. Mainstream archaeology resists such interpretations, insisting they were ceremonial or symbolic. But if symbolism alone drove such labor, why not choose simpler means? Why cut stone with the precision of modern tools if function was irrelevant? These questions hang over the ruins like unanswered prayers. The myths entwined with these ruins speak in a different voice. In Aymara tradition, the world before the flood was peopled by giants whose hubris brought destruction. Viracocha unleashed waters that drowned them, sparing only those chosen to repopulate the world. When explorers and missionaries first recorded these stories, they dismissed them as echoes of biblical tales. Yet the details are too rooted in place, too bound to the geography of Titicaca, to be mere borrowings. The flood begins here, the god emerges here, the survivors emerge here. The myth is tied to this land like stone to earth, and within it may lie a memory of upheaval, an ancient catastrophe now visible only in fragmentary geology and submerged walls. If the myths encode memory, then the ruins encode silence. They stand as testimony without testimony, mute witnesses to a past whose voice has been stolen. The Incas, who absorbed these sites into their empire, claimed them as sacred origins, but could not explain their construction. The Spanish, eager to dissolve indigenous power, reinterpreted the myths to fit their theology, reducing Viracocha to a shadow of their own god. In both cases, the deeper truth was not preserved, but overwritten. What survives is a palimpsest, each layer obscuring as much as it reveals. The silence deepens when one recalls the submerged structures found beneath Titicaca's waters. Divers have reported terraces, walls, and even roadways beneath the lake. In 2000, the discovery of a vast temple-like structure was announced, sparking brief fascination before fading again into obscurity. Why did such a discovery not alter our understanding of Andean history? Perhaps because it threatened the stability of established narratives, raising questions that official scholarship is reluctant to entertain. To admit a drowned city is to admit a rupture larger than conventional timelines allow, and to admit that memory encoded in myth may be truer than history written in chronicles. And so the ruins remain in a liminal state, too real to dismiss, too unsettling to embrace. They are anomalies, standing outside the tidy arc of human progress. We are told to see them as the culmination of one culture or another, yet they continue to resist absorption into familiar categories. This resistance is itself instructive. It reminds us that history is not complete, that what we call knowledge may be only a reflection, shimmering on the surface of a much deeper water. The Andean landscape enforces this lesson with its very geology. Mountains rise like frozen waves, valleys stretch in silence, and the lake itself holds within it cycles of inundation and retreat. Science confirms what myth suggests, that this land has known cataclysms, that its waters have risen and fallen, swallowing and revealing in endless rhythm. If a city once stood where now the lake spreads, then its erasure was not only physical, but narrative. The people who survived would have reshaped their story. carrying memory as myth, until it was reframed and rewritten by conquerors who sought to control the meaning of the past. Control of memory is power. To declare a site sacred is to claim its authority. To redefine a god is to reshape destiny. The Incas understood this when they wove Titicaca into their mythology. The Spanish understood it when they replaced Viracocha with Christ. Both acts reveal a truth darker than the stones, that history is not only what happened, but what is allowed to be remembered. And what is not allowed to be remembered sinks, like cities beneath the water, into silence. Yet silence is never absolute. The stones remain, heavy and immovable, their precision mocking our explanations. The myths remain, shifting and reframed, yet still whispering of floods, gods, and vanished peoples. The lake remains, reflecting the sky while concealing its depths. Together they resist erasure, compelling us to face the possibility that what has been forgotten may be greater than what we know. At dawn, when the silver light spreads across Titicaca, one can feel the weight of this possibility. The water gleams like a mirror to the cosmos, and in that mirror lie both truth and concealment. The ruins on the shore stand in mute defiance of time. The myths rise again in memory, stubborn in their persistence. And the silence deepens, not as absence but as presence, reminding us that history is not only a record of what has been remembered, but also a measure of what has been deliberately forgotten. Perhaps that is the true meaning of the Atlantis of the Andes. It is not a lost city waiting to be uncovered in full, but a reminder of erasure itself, of how civilizations vanish, how knowledge is buried, how power rewrites memory. To confront the silence of Titicaca is to confront the fragility of history, the ease with which truths sink beneath the waves, and the haunting possibility that what we think we know is only the surface of a far deeper abyss. The sun climbs higher, the lake brightens, and the world awakens. Yet beneath the calm surface, the questions remain, suspended like drowned echoes. What lies beneath, unseen, waiting? And if it rises again, will we recognize it for what it is? Or will we bury it once more in silence? The midday sun on the altiplano is merciless. Shadows vanish, and the air vibrates with heat that seems out of place in a land so close to the sky. Lake Titicaca shimmers under the intensity, its surface dazzling, almost blinding, as if refusing to reveal what lies beneath. It is in this harsh clarity that the paradox of the Andes becomes most visible. Everything appears exposed, yet the deeper truths remain hidden. The ruins, the myths, the fragments of memory, they are in plain sight, but none give themselves away easily. In this blinding light, one is drawn to the question of power. Who first claimed the authority of this landscape? The Tiahuanaco culture is the usual answer, a people who flourished between the 5th and 10th centuries, leaving behind artifacts of intricate artistry and evidence of complex urban life. They are credited with the creation of Tiahuanaco, with its vast ceremonial center, temples, and monoliths. And yet, even as archaeology situates them within time, the scale of their achievement seems to suggest something older, something rooted in knowledge already ancient when they began. The Tiahuanaco may have inherited as much as they invented, shaping their society from fragments of a past already fragmented. This inheritance is visible in their art. Pottery and stone carvings depict figures that merge human and animal forms, eyes wide with a trance-like intensity, geometric patterns suggesting cosmological order. Some of these figures resemble those carved on the gateway of the sun, as if preserving symbols whose full meanings had already slipped from human grasp. It is as though Tiahuanacu carried forward echoes rather than voices, fragments rather than continuity. What they built was magnificent, yet even in its magnificence it hints at loss, at a culture remembering only in part. The myths deepen this sense of partial memory. Stories of giants destroyed in floods, of Viracocha rising from the waters to bring order, of humanity reshaped after catastrophe, all suggest a cycle of knowledge given and withdrawn, remembered and forgotten. What is striking is the way these myths are tied to geography. The flood originates not in abstract mythic space, but in Titicaca itself. The god emerges not from heaven, but from the lake. The catastrophe is not a distant metaphor, but an event tied to the very stones and waters of the plateau. To dismiss these stories as simple fictions is to underestimate their rootedness in place. They are not myths of imagination alone, but of landscape, memory, and survival. When we listen closely, we hear the dissonance between memory and history. Archaeology insists on dates, stratigraphy, cultural sequences. Myth insists on catastrophe, gods, and floods. Yet the two converge in unsettling ways. Geological evidence confirms dramatic changes in Titicaca's water levels, sudden rises and falls capable of erasing entire settlements. Archaeological surveys beneath the lake confirm structures that do not belong where they now lie. Oral traditions insist these were once cities, drowned in punishment or disaster. The convergence is not neat, but it is undeniable. Myth and science both point to rupture, to civilizations drowned and silenced. And yet the silence persists. Why, if so much evidence exists, does the broader story remain unresolved? Part of the answer lies in control. Memory, after all, is a kind of power. The Incas understood this when they declared the island of the sun as their birthplace, rewriting the sacred landscape to validate their empire. The Spanish understood it when they rebranded Viracocha as a distorted vision of the Christian God, erasing the autonomy of Andean cosmology. Both layers of appropriation stripped away original voices, leaving behind only fragments shaped by conquerors. The result is a history that feels incomplete because it is incomplete, deliberately so. Even in modern times, discoveries that might disrupt established narratives tend to be marginalized. Reports of the submerged temple complex in 2000 made headlines briefly, then faded from mainstream discourse. Scholars debated, papers were published, but the potential implications, an ancient city drowned beneath Titicaca, were never allowed to reshape the broader narrative. Perhaps this reluctance reflects caution, the hesitance to leap from anomaly to conclusion. Or perhaps it reflects something deeper, the institutional tendency to preserve stability, to avoid rewriting history unless forced. Silence, in this sense, becomes not only the product of catastrophe, but the choice of those who curate knowledge. The silence is broken only by the stones themselves. The monoliths of Puma Punku, with their precision and scale, refuse dismissal. The gateway of the sun, with its carvings, refuses to be emptied of meaning. The submerged terraces, steps, and walls refuse to dissolve into the mud. These remnants are stubborn, immovable. They mock our inability to explain them fully, reminding us that forgetting is never absolute. Even when knowledge is erased, fragments remain, compelling us to confront the gap between what we know and what we sense must have been. And so the idea of the Atlantis of the Andes persists, not because it has been proven, but because the silence itself suggests concealment. Myths of drowned cities, ruins too precise to fit comfortably in timelines, fragments of memory overwritten by empires. All of this builds a sense that something more lies beneath. Perhaps Atlantis is not a single lost city, but a recurring pattern. Civilizations that rise, flourish, and vanish, leaving behind questions too large to ignore. In this pattern, Titicaca is not an anomaly, but a chapter, one of many, in humanity's long dance with memory and forgetting. To stand on the sunlit shore of the lake is to feel this tension in every ripple of water, every block of stone. The brightness blinds, yet in the blinding clarity lies concealment. What is hidden beneath the surface remains unseen, and perhaps deliberately so. History is a mirror like Titicaca, reflecting only the surface while concealing the depths. We look and we see only part of what is there. As the sun climbs higher, the light grows harsher, and the lake's surface becomes a sheet of flame. No divers descend, no ruins emerge, only silence glimmers back. It is in this silence that the true weight of the mystery resides, not in the possibility of definitive answers, but in the recognition that history itself is fragile, easily rewritten, easily erased. The ruins and myths do not close the story, but open it wider, insisting that what has been forgotten may be larger than what has been preserved. Perhaps that is why the myth of Atlantis resonates here, on the altiplano. It is not only a question of lost cities, but of lost truths, of knowledge drowned and memory broken. The lake, the ruins, the myths, they are reminders that beneath every surface lies a silence, and within every silence lies a story waiting, unseen, unheard, for those willing to ask questions that have no simple answers. The afternoon light over the altiplano softens into a golden haze, settling upon the waters of Lake Titicaca as if attempting to soothe its secrets into slumber. Yet nothing here truly rests. The reeds rustle with whispers, and the stones, heavy and unmoving, seem to hum with echoes from ages no one can clearly recall. It is in this suspended hour, between brightness and dusk, that the mystery feels most pressing. For the lake is both stage and witness, and the ruins at its edge and beneath its surface are actors in a drama whose script has been scattered, rewritten, and half-burned by time. The ruins themselves speak in the language of silence. At Puma Punku, blocks of andesite and sandstone lie strewn across the earth, not in randomness, but in a disarray that suggests sudden disruption. Many of these blocks bear marks of deliberate design. Precision cuts, sharp angles, and deep recesses that appear as if they were meant to interlock in some modular system. To walk among them is to sense incompletion, as though a vast construction project was halted mid-motion, struck by disaster or abandoned under duress. Archaeologists debate endlessly whether earthquakes, floods, or human conflict shattered the site, but the larger question remains unanswered. Why was so much knowledge invested in these stones, only for the project to end in ruin? The Gate of the Sun adds another layer of mystery. Carved from a single block weighing many tons, it stands upright, its surface etched with a central deity figure, arms outstretched, flanked by rows of winged beings. Scholars call the figure Viracocha, but even this identification is uncertain. Some argue the carvings form a calendar of solar cycles, perhaps mapping centuries. Others see mythological narrative, symbols of creation and destruction. Whatever its meaning, the gate embodies the fusion of cosmos and stone, myth and matter. It is not merely an artifact, but a message. The difficulty lies in the fact that the message has lost its language. We can see the symbols, but their voices no longer speak. This muteness of the stones mirrors the muteness of history itself. The Tiahuanaco civilization, credited with the creation of these monuments, left behind no written records, no texts to explain their cosmology, engineering, or intentions. What survives are fragments, artifacts, ruins, and oral traditions preserved by descendants who themselves inherited more silence than clarity. The Incas revered the site, but admitted it was not theirs. The Spanish chroniclers wrote of the ruins, but filtered everything through the lens of their own theology, reducing Viracocha to a distorted echo of their god, and the flood to a shadow of Noah's Ark. In every retelling, the original voice grew fainter, until what we have now is less a story than a palimpsest, a layering of interpretations that obscure as much as they reveal. And yet, through the silence, certain patterns insist upon themselves. Across the world, myths of flood and destruction recur with striking similarity. Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, Mesoamerica, the Andes. Civilizations speak of gods who punish humanity, of waters that rise and erase, of survivors who begin again. To dismiss these as coincidence is tempting, but the persistence of the theme suggests otherwise. Perhaps these myths encode memory of real cataclysms, local or global, that reshaped landscapes and lives. Geological studies of Titicaca confirm cycles of dramatic change. Periods when it swelled into a vast inland sea, others when it nearly dried to salt flats. A sudden inundation could have drowned settlements, leaving survivors to remember in the only way they could, through story. The stones themselves, submerged beneath the waters, are their confirmation. The discoveries of the early 21st century only reinforce this possibility. Divers exploring Titicaca's depths reported walls, steps, and terraces beneath the surface, culminating in the identification of what was described as a massive temple complex. Extending more than a kilometer, with features resembling plazas and roads, it seemed to validate the myths of drowned cities. Yet instead of transforming the narrative, the discovery faded into quiet debate, acknowledged but not embraced. The reluctance to accept its significance may be less about evidence than about implication. To admit a city drowned beneath Titicaca is to admit the incompleteness of history itself, to concede that memory may reside in myth as much as in stratigraphy. The theme of erasure returns again and again. The Inca appropriated Titicaca into their imperial mythology, declaring its islands sacred, the birthplace of their lineage. The Spanish imposed their own narratives, silencing indigenous voices, burning temples, recasting myths. Even modern scholarship, cautious and rigorous, sometimes contributes to this erasure by dismissing anomalies rather than confronting them. The result is a layered forgetting. Natural disaster, conquest, institutional silence, all conspiring to submerge the truth more thoroughly than water ever could. And yet, the persistence of fragments suggests that erasure is never complete. The stones of Puma Punku remain, stubborn in their precision. The gate of the sun stands, its carvings defiant in their muteness. The myths survive in the voices of Aymara and Quechua storytellers who speak of Viracocha and the flood as though remembering an event both distant and near. The lake itself, reflecting the sky by day and the stars by night, conceals but also reminds, its surface a constant prompt that what is hidden is not gone. It is tempting to long for certainty, to wish that the drowned temple might rise intact, that the carvings might yield their meaning, that a text might be discovered to resolve the silence. But perhaps certainty is not the gift of this place. Perhaps its gift is the reminder that history is not linear, not secure, not immune to rupture. Civilizations rise, they master stone and sky, they vanish, and in their absence myths grow to bridge the silence. What remains is not clarity but resonance, not conclusion but question. As dusk descends, the lake darkens again, becoming less mirror and more abyss. Shadows lengthen across the altiplano, and the ruins are swallowed by twilight. Yet the silence feels charged, alive with the weight of memory. To stand here is to sense that the Atlantis of the Andes is not only a myth, but a warning, that forgetting is never final, that what we bury returns in fragments, demanding recognition. The stones, the myths, the submerged ruins, they are not answers but mirrors, reflecting our own fragility. And so the question lingers, unresolved. Was there truly a city beneath these waters, a civilization erased by flood and time? Or is the city itself the metaphor, a reminder that history is always incomplete, that what we call truth is only the surface of something deeper? The lake does not answer. It only holds the silence, vast and immovable, as if to say that some truths can only be approached, never possessed. The night settles over the altiplano like a cloak, and the waters of Titicaca shift from silver to black glass, reflecting the constellations with a clarity so sharp it unsettles the eye. The Milky Way seems close enough to touch, arching across the heavens in a radiant sweep, and the stars shimmer as if the lake itself were holding them captive. For the ancient peoples who lived here, the sky and the water were inseparable, a mirrored reality in which the motions of the cosmos found their echo on earth. To stand here in the silence of night is to feel that continuity, to sense that the ruins are not merely stones, but coordinates within a vast cosmic map whose meaning has been fractured but not erased. Among these fractured coordinates, the island of the sun holds a place of particular weight. For the Incas, this island was sacred ground, the birthplace of their first ancestors. Chroniclers recorded that they believed the sun itself had emerged from this very spot, marking it as a cosmic axis. Archaeologists have found ruins of temples and ceremonial platforms, confirming that the island was indeed a center of ritual. But even here, as with Tiahuanaco, there are traces of older layers beneath the Incan structures, evidence of occupation long before the empire rose. The Incas, as they often did, grafted their mythology onto existing sacred sites, reshaping memory to serve imperial authority. What was once the locus of an older cosmology became the Incan cradle of creation. The past was not preserved but absorbed, silenced beneath a new voice. This pattern is repeated across the Andean plateau. Every empire reshaped the memory of those who came before, sometimes by reverence, sometimes by erasure. Yet the ruins stubbornly resist such manipulation. The monoliths of Puma Punku do not surrender their secrets simply because the Incas claimed them, nor do the carvings on the gateway of the sun vanish because the Spanish dismissed them as pagan invention. The stones remain, heavy and silent, bearing witness to histories no empire could fully erase. They remind us that memory, even when buried, never vanishes completely. It lingers like starlight, faint but persistent, crossing ages to remind the present of what has been lost. And yet, this persistence only deepens the unease. If the Atlantis of the Andes was real, if a city or civilization once thrived here before being drowned or erased, why is its memory so fragmented? Why are there no continuous traditions, no unbroken line of transmission? The myths of Viracocha tell of destruction and renewal, of gods emerging from the lake, reshaping humanity, then vanishing into the horizon. These stories may encode the rupture itself, a collective memory of catastrophe so complete that it severed the chain of knowledge. Survivors may have carried fragments forward, but in fragments only, unable to sustain the whole. Over time, the fragments hardened into myth, into symbols both revealing and concealing. Geology offers a parallel explanation. The Andes have always been a land of instability, shaped by tectonic forces, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and shifting climates. Evidence shows that Lake Titicaca has alternately expanded and contracted, flooding valleys and then receding into desolation. A sudden rise in waters, perhaps triggered by glacial melt at the end of the last ice age, could easily have erased settlements along the shore. For those who lived through it, the event would have seemed divine punishment, an act of gods. In myth, it became the flood of Viracocha, the destruction of giants, the drowning of cities. In archaeology, it became submerged walls, terraces, and temples glimpsed only by divers centuries later. Both ways of knowing point to rupture, but neither can fully reconstruct what was lost. Even today, the silence around these discoveries feels engineered. When divers reported a vast submerged structure in 2000, described as a temple complex stretching for more than a kilometer, it seemed to confirm long-held traditions of drowned cities. Yet the discovery quickly receded into obscurity, treated more as curiosity than revolution. Was it academic caution, or was it the inertia of narratives unwilling to bend? Silence, once again, enveloped the ruins, just as the lake itself envelopes what lies beneath. It is a silence that frustrates but also instructs, reminding us that history is not simply what happened, but what is allowed to be remembered. And so the Atlantis of the Andes hovers between presence and absence, between myth and evidence. It exists in fragments, a stone block cut too precisely to dismiss, a myth too consistent to ignore, a submerged wall too deliberate to be natural. These fragments do not form a complete picture, but they form a resonance, a vibration that unsettles the stability of the official story. Perhaps this is why the myth persists, not because it has been proven, but because the silence around it suggests something is being withheld. Silence, in this case, is not absence, but presence in disguise, a veil drawn across truths too disruptive to be comfortably acknowledged. To stand at the edge of the lake at night is to feel that presence in every ripple of water and every glimmer of star. The Incas may have claimed this place as their origin. The Spanish may have reduced it to a shadow of their god, but the lake itself remains sovereign, unclaimed, untamed. It reflects the heavens as faithfully as it did centuries ago, and beneath its surface, it keeps its own counsel. The stones on its shores stand as sentinels, guardians of secrets no empire could erase. Together, lake and stone form a silence that is not emptiness but fullness, a silence heavy with what cannot yet be spoken. Perhaps this is the true lesson of the Atlantis of the Andes, that history is not linear but broken, that civilizations rise not only to flourish but to be forgotten, and that forgetting is itself part of the pattern. To search for the drowned city beneath Titicaca is to confront not only the fragility of human memory, but the inevitability of erasure. The myths and ruins do not restore the lost city. They remind us that loss itself is the greater reality. The stars continue to shimmer on the lake's surface, indifferent to human questions. They have watched civilizations rise and fall, watched myths grow and fade, watched silence deepen across centuries. In their light, one feels both awe and futility, the awe of glimpsing eternity, the futility of knowing how small and transient human memory truly is. The lake does not yield its secrets, the stones do not explain themselves, and the myths remain tantalizingly incomplete. And yet, the very incompleteness compels us. It forces us to keep asking, to keep searching, to keep listening to the silence. For it may be that the Atlantis of the Andes is not meant to be rediscovered in its entirety. Perhaps its gift is the reminder that silence is never empty, that what we cannot know still shapes us, and that beneath every surface, whether water, stone, or memory, there lies a deeper story waiting, unseen, unheard, but never gone. Morning breaks cold and pale across the vast altiplano, and the horizon glows faintly as though the earth itself exhales light. Lake Titicaca lies still in the dawn, a mirror of silver gray that seems to blur sky and water into one. The reeds stand silent along the edges, their shadows stretching into the mist. In such stillness, one cannot help but sense that this landscape guards more than it reveals, that beneath its calm surface lie fragments of memory too heavy to rise. The ruins at its shores, mute, massive, immovable, echo this weight. They are not merely relics, but questions carved into stone, questions whose answers remain drowned in silence. At Tiahuanaco, the mysteries of construction deepen with every stone examined. The walls of Cala Sasaya rise with rough grandeur, their monoliths aligned with celestial points. Archaeologists argue about whether it served as a calendar or a ceremonial court, but the precision of its orientation suggests a knowledge of astronomy that demands respect. Some researchers have proposed that the temple could mark solstices, equinoxes, and even complex planetary cycles. If true, this implies a culture whose grasp of the heavens matched their mastery of stone. Yet the rupture of history leaves us uncertain. Were they truly the originators of such knowledge, or the inheritors of wisdom carried forward from a civilization now erased? The stones of Puma Punku complicate the question even further. The H-blocks, with their intricate recesses and sharp right angles, appear designed to interlock like components of an engineered system. Some blocks display drill holes that suggest rotary tools, a detail difficult to reconcile with the stone hammers and chisels archaeologists attribute to Tiahuanaco masons. Skeptics argue these impressions have been exaggerated, the product of patient labor rather than advanced methods. But even if that were true, the question remains: why invest such labor in designs so precise, so modular, that they seem to belong to a logic more functional than ornamental? The silence of the stones does not resolve the debate, it only intensifies it. The myths surrounding the ruins echo this silence with their own enigmatic voices. In the tales of Viracocha, the great creator emerges from Lake Titicaca after a time of darkness and chaos. He fashions humanity anew after a flood, teaches arts and agriculture, then vanishes across the sea. This motif of a departing god, a bringer of knowledge who leaves humanity half-prepared, resonates across world traditions, from Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica to Oannes in Mesopotamia. The recurrence suggests more than coincidence. It hints at a deep, cross-cultural memory of sudden loss and sudden gift, of wisdom given and then withdrawn. If Viracocha was not merely myth but memory, then what knowledge was granted here, and why was it lost? Geological evidence lends the myths a shadow of plausibility. Studies of the Titicaca Basin reveal that the lake's levels have fluctuated violently over millennia. At times the water shrank, leaving behind salt flats. At others, it rose and drowned entire valleys. Such upheaval would have erased communities, forcing survivors to rebuild on higher ground. Oral traditions of floods, of gods punishing corrupted beings, may encode memories of these cataclysms. In myth, the water rose at the will of Viracocha. In geology, it rose through glacial melt and tectonic shifts. Both explanations tell of destruction. Both preserve the memory of a rupture. And in the silence between them, the ruins stand as testimony, heavy with unspoken meaning. The question of erasure remains central. Why, if these people mastered such engineering and astronomy, did their knowledge vanish so abruptly? One answer lies in conquest and appropriation. The Incas, in their imperial expansion, claimed the island of the sun as their birthplace, weaving Titicaca into their cosmology. The Spanish, centuries later, dismantled temples and silenced indigenous voices, reframing Viracocha as a distorted anticipation of the Christian God. Each conquest brought not preservation, but rewriting, stripping away the autonomy of the myths and binding them to the needs of power. The ruins, in this process, became stage props in imperial narratives rather than voices of their own truth. But even before the Incas, rupture may have been intrinsic. Civilizations do not always decline gently. Sometimes they collapse abruptly, knowledge vanishing with them. A catastrophe, whether flood, drought, or quake, could erase not only settlements but memory itself. Survivors may carry fragments, but fragments alone are fragile, easily lost in the silence of time. Over generations, fragments become myths, and myths are dismissed as fictions. The drowned cities of Titicaca may have been real, yet their memory survives only in whispers of floods and vanished gods. The reports of submerged structures in the lake breathe life into these whispers. Divers have spoken of stone walls, steps, and terraces lying beneath the surface. In 2000, the identification of a vast temple-like complex seemed to confirm what tradition had long held, that beneath Titicaca's waters lie the ruins of forgotten cities. Yet even this discovery was met with quiet hesitation. Instead of reshaping our understanding of Andean history, it slipped into obscurity, noted, but not embraced. Why? Perhaps because to admit it would unravel too much, demanding we acknowledge that history, as we know it, is incomplete, that silence is not absence but concealment. The silence endures, yet so do the questions. What if the Atlantis of the Andes is not only real, but emblematic of a broader truth? That civilizations rise and vanish more often than we realize, leaving behind only fragments too strange to fit comfortably into official narratives. What if myths are not merely stories, but coded memories, fragile vessels carrying truths across the abyss of forgetting? To listen to them is to risk discomfort, to confront the possibility that the past is far larger than the tidy timeline we inherit. The morning grows brighter, the mist lifts, and the lake gleams like a second sky. Villagers move across its waters in reed boats as they have for centuries, their lives woven into a continuity the ruins seem to contradict. The stones of Puma Punku lie silent. The gateway of the sun stares into the horizon. The submerged temple sleeps beneath dark waters. Yet all are connected, fragments of a larger story whose full shape remains concealed. The silence is not empty, but charged, as though waiting for the right question, the right moment for memory to surface. Perhaps that is the true weight of Lake Titicaca's mystery. It is not simply about lost cities or drowned temples, but about the fragility of human memory itself. Civilizations rise, they carve stone and map the heavens, then they vanish, leaving only silence where once there was knowledge. The lake reflects this truth as faithfully as it reflects the sky, that forgetting is as natural as remembering, that loss is as enduring as creation. And so the ruins and the myths do not offer closure, but a mirror, compelling us to see ourselves within the cycle of rise and erasure. We, too, will leave behind fragments. We, too, will be remembered in silence more than in speech. Lake Titicaca whispers this truth in every ripple, every stone, every shadow beneath its surface. What we call Atlantis may not be a city at all, but the inevitability of loss, the memory of forgetting itself. The afternoon winds sweep across the altiplano like an invisible tide, bending the reeds along the shoreline of Lake Titicaca. The water shivers in their touch, glinting beneath a sun that feels eternal, and yet the feeling of fragility clings to the landscape. Here, among stones older than memory and myths that refuse to die, one senses that time itself is fractured, that the past has been buried not only beneath the lake, but beneath the layers of silence that civilizations leave behind. To approach these ruins is not to find answers, but to confront questions that echo louder with each stone examined. The story of Tiahuanaco, as reconstructed by archaeologists, speaks of a thriving city that once commanded influence across much of the southern Andes. It was a center of ritual, agriculture, and trade, a hub whose people engineered terraces and irrigation systems that supported large populations. Their influence stretched into present-day Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, their artistry visible in ceramics, textiles, and carvings. Yet by the time the Incas rose to power centuries later, Tiahuanaco was already a ruin, its stones silent, its people dispersed. The question remains, why did such a society collapse, and why so completely? Some scholars point to climate. Around the year 1000 CE, the region is believed to have suffered a prolonged drought that strained agriculture, forcing populations to disperse. Without water, the vast terraces and canals could not sustain life. In this explanation, the collapse of Tiahuanaco was not mysterious but inevitable, the result of environmental change. And yet, this tidy narrative falters when one considers the grandeur of the stones, the precision of the architecture, the astronomical alignments that hint at deeper knowledge. Could a society capable of such sophistication simply vanish because of drought alone? Or was the drought only one piece of a larger rupture, a spark that ignited the unraveling of a much more fragile memory. It is here that myth once again enters, refusing to let silence settle. The Aymara people, descendants of those who once lived among the ruins, tell of giants destroyed by floods, of a god emerging from the lake to renew humanity. These stories do not speak of gradual decline, but of sudden catastrophe, a rupture that erased more than lives. It erased continuity itself. Could the myth of a flood be the memory of the collapse? Could the vanishing of Tiahuanacu's people reflect not only environmental hardship, but a cultural shattering so complete that knowledge itself was drowned? The ruins of Puma Punku intensify the mystery. The stones scattered across the plain suggest not only destruction, but violent upheaval, as though something tore the structures apart. Earthquakes, perhaps, or sudden collapse. The blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, lie broken as though a hand greater than human had toppled them. Their precise cuts and interlocking shapes seem almost mocking in their silence, daring us to explain them with the tools we know were available. Were they truly the product of Tiahuanacu's artisans, or the inheritance of knowledge carried from a deeper antiquity? The debate persists, unresolved, each stone both evidence and enigma. And then there is the water. Lake Titicaca itself plays the role of both destroyer and preserver. Its shifting levels over millennia would have drowned some settlements while exposing others. Divers in the 20th century discovered terraces and walls beneath its surface, fragments of drowned architecture that echo the myths of sunken cities. In 2000, the reported discovery of a vast temple complex beneath the lake stirred imaginations, only for the story to retreat into academic obscurity. Why does such a discovery, if true, not reshape the narrative of Andean history? Perhaps because it complicates the story too much, raising questions that cannot be easily contained within familiar timelines. The control of narrative has always been central to the power surrounding Titicaca. The Incas claimed the lake as their sacred origin, weaving it into their imperial mythology. The Spanish overlaid the myths with Christian interpretations, silencing indigenous voices in the process. Each act of appropriation was a form of erasure, reshaping memory into something useful for power. What remains is not clarity, but a palimpsest, each layer obscuring what came before. If Atlantis exists in the Andes, perhaps it is not only a lost city, but this very process, the deliberate drowning of memory beneath waves of conquest and reinterpretation. Yet the ruins resist erasure. The Gate of the Sun still stands, its deity carved in stone, arms outstretched, surrounded by winged figures whose meanings remain obscured. The H-blocks of Puma Punku still lie scattered, their precision undiminished by centuries of neglect. The submerged terraces still sleep beneath the lake, waiting for divers to glimpse them once more. These fragments refuse to vanish, even if their voices have been muted. They are reminders that forgetting is never absolute, that silence itself carries memory in ways we cannot always decipher. To walk among these ruins is to feel the weight of that silence pressing in, demanding contemplation. The stones do not explain themselves, but they compel questions that disturb the comfort of neat timelines. If Tiahuanacu fell to drought, why do the myths speak of flood? If the Incas were inheritors, what knowledge did they inherit, and why did they not preserve it more fully? If the Spanish silenced indigenous voices, what truths did they bury with them? And beneath all of this lies the most haunting question. How many times has humanity risen and fallen? How many civilizations have been drowned in silence, leaving behind only fragments too strange to be absorbed into official history? The winds grow colder as the sun lowers over the lake, and shadows stretch long across the plain. The ruins glow faintly in the last light, their shapes softened, but their presence undeniable. They are not merely stones, but mirrors, reflecting not only a forgotten past, but the fragility of memory itself. What was lost here may never be fully known, but its absence speaks as loudly as any record. Perhaps that is the true meaning of the Atlantis of the Andes. It is not simply a drowned city, but a reminder that history is not secure, that memory can be severed as easily as breath in the thin Andean air. The ruins and myths do not offer closure, but a challenge, compelling us to confront the limits of what we know and the vastness of what has been lost. The lake, darkening into night, whispers this truth with every ripple, that beneath the silence lies a story larger than we can imagine, a story still waiting, unseen, unspoken, but never gone. The twilight of the altiplano spread slowly, painting the horizon in violet and copper. Lake Titicaca reflects these shifting colors, turning itself into a vast canvas of fading light. The reeds murmur in the evening wind, and the cold descends with a suddenness that feels almost otherworldly. It is at this hour that the landscape appears most ancient, as though every stone and ripple remembers a past older than any record, a memory that refuses to fade completely. The ruins, silhouetted against the dimming sky, remind us again of the central paradox of this land. So much has been preserved in stone, and yet the story itself is fractured, silenced, incomplete. The silence draws us back to the ruins of Tiahuanaco and the enigmatic structures of Puma Punku. Archaeologists explain these as the ceremonial and administrative heart of the Tiahuanacu culture, but the sheer scale of ambition evident in the stones challenges that frame. These were not modest temples or simple civic buildings. They were colossal undertakings, projects that demanded immense labor, organization, and vision. Why, then, does their cultural legacy feel so incomplete? If Tiahuanacu was the heart of a vast empire, why do we find so few traces of continuity in the civilizations that followed? The Incas revered the site, but they could not explain it. The Spanish chroniclers recorded their awe, but they too admitted that the origin of the ruins was unknown. It is as if the knowledge behind these monuments was swallowed whole, erased not gradually but abruptly. The myths may provide a clue. Viracocha, the great creator, emerges again and again in these narratives, shaping humanity after floods, teaching knowledge, then departing into the horizon. His figure dominates the gateway of the sun, where his visage is surrounded by winged beings and strange symbols. Some scholars see in this image a celestial code, a representation of solar cycles. Others argue it depicts a narrative of destruction and renewal, a myth of cosmic rupture. But perhaps its most important feature is the silence it represents. Viracocha is not a god of permanence. He is a god of absence, of withdrawal. He gives knowledge, then leaves, leaving behind fragments that humanity must preserve imperfectly. The ruins, in this sense, are less monuments of continuity than reminders of rupture, physical testimonies of knowledge that once was and is no more. The idea of rupture is reinforced by the natural history of the lake itself. Geological studies show that Titicaca has fluctuated dramatically, alternately shrinking to salt flats and expanding to swallow valleys. Such shifts would have destroyed communities, altered agriculture, and rewritten landscapes. Myths of floods and drowned cities are not surprising in such a context. They may reflect not imagination, but experience. A sudden rise in waters could erase an entire settlement in days, leaving survivors to remember in the form of stories. Over time, those stories would become myth, encoding both catastrophe and meaning. When divers report terraces, walls, and temples beneath the lake, they may be glimpsing not legends, but the drowned remnants of those ruptures. Yet the silence of history is not only natural, it is political. The Incas, in their imperial vision, absorbed the lake into their mythology, claiming the island of the sun as the birthplace of their ancestors. The Spanish, in turn, reshaped these myths to fit Christian frameworks, rebranding Viracocha as a distorted anticipation of their god. In both cases, the act of appropriation was also an act of erasure, suppressing older voices to impose new meanings. The Atlantis of the Andes, if it exists, is buried not only in water, but in narrative. Its memory survives only in fragments because its full story was deliberately overwritten. This raises an unsettling thought. What if the true Atlantis is not a city, but the act of forgetting itself? What if what was lost here is not merely stone, but the continuity of memory, broken by catastrophe and conquest, rewritten so thoroughly that only fragments remain? The ruins themselves suggest this possibility. Their precision, their grandeur, their alignments to sky and water, they all speak of a vision larger than what archaeology allows. Yet that vision was silenced, its voice replaced by the narratives of empires. The drowned ruins beneath Titicaca are more than lost cities. They are metaphors for lost truths, for knowledge submerged beneath the currents of power and time. And still, fragments resist. The H-blocks of Puma Punku lie scattered yet defiant, their sharp lines mocking our ignorance. The gateway of the sun still gazes outward, its deity frozen in silent proclamation. The submerged temple complex reported in 2000 remains in the shadows, neither fully denied nor fully embraced. Each fragment resists total erasure, carrying enough weight to demand attention, enough silence to provoke unease. These remnants remind us that forgetting is never complete, that memory lingers even in fragments, whispering through the silence. As twilight deepens into night, the stars reappear, mirrored in the black waters of the lake. The constellations stretch across the heavens with a clarity that ties sky to earth, past to present. For the ancient peoples of the Andes, this mirrored world was the very foundation of meaning. The heavens and the lake reflected one another, and humanity lived between them, subject to both. When myths speak of gods emerging from water, of floods destroying civilizations, of knowledge given and withdrawn, they reflect this worldview. That existence itself is precarious, suspended between cycles of creation and erasure. Perhaps this is why the myths persist even when the stones remain mute. They are less explanations than reminders, less stories than warnings. They tell us that civilizations do not vanish quietly but with rupture, that knowledge is fragile, that memory is as vulnerable to drowning as cities are to floods. The Atlantis of the Andes, then, is not only a legend but a pattern a reminder that what has been lost may always be greater than what remains. The lake grows darker, the winds colder, and the silence deeper. Yet within that silence lies presence, not absence. The stones, the myths, the submerged ruins, they do not provide answers, but they insist that the questions remain alive. To stand here is to recognize that history is not a completed story, but an unfinished one, always fractured, always incomplete. The Atlantis of the Andes is not waiting to be discovered in full. It is already here, in the silence, in the fragments, in the haunting reminder that forgetting is never total, and that what we seek may already be speaking in ways we have yet to learn how to hear. The chill of dawn creeps slowly across the altiplano, frost glistening on the tufts of grass that cling to the earth. The lake breathes in silence, its surface calm yet heavy with an unseen weight, as if it carries beneath its waters the burden of forgotten civilizations. The wind, sharp and thin at this altitude, moves through the reeds with a whisper that seems to echo voices not entirely gone. To linger here is to feel that memory itself is alive, restless, pressing against the boundaries of silence, asking to be remembered. The ruins, scattered across the plains and hidden beneath the lake, are fragments of this memory. Each stone speaks of intention. Massive blocks carved and transported with care, interlocking forms designed with precision, orientations aligned to the movements of the heavens. They testify to a people who saw no boundary between the earth beneath their feet and the cosmos above their heads. To shape stone was to shape destiny, to carve knowledge into matter so it could endure. And yet, that endurance has become a paradox, for the stones remain while the meaning they carried has been severed, leaving us with fragments without voice. Archaeologists explain the Tiahuanaco culture as the architects of this grandeur, a society that flourished for centuries before collapsing into silence around the year 1000 CE. They point to climate change, to prolonged drought, to the exhaustion of resources. And surely these played a role. Yet the scale of the monuments, the intricacy of their design, the cosmological order embedded into their construction all suggest something more. Could such achievements vanish so suddenly, leaving almost no continuity, no gradual transition of knowledge? The silence that follows Tiahuanaco feels less like decline and more like rupture. It is as though an entire world was drowned, not only in water, but in forgetting. The myths confirm the sense of rupture. In Aymara and Quechua traditions, the story of Viracocha is not one of continuity, but of erasure and renewal. Humanity, in its first form, was destroyed by flood, erased for its failures. From the waters, Viracocha reshaped the world, creating new people, teaching arts and order, then departing. The myth insists on cycles: destruction, renewal, withdrawal. Its resonance with global flood traditions, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, suggests a deeper memory, one carried across cultures as testimony to cataclysms too profound to forget. To dismiss these myths as allegory is to underestimate their weight. They are fragments of truth woven into story, fragile vessels for memory across generations. When divers discovered submerged structures in Titicaca, myths and archaeology converged in unsettling ways. Reports of terraces, walls, and a vast temple-like complex beneath the waters echo the old tales of drowned cities. Geological evidence supports the possibility. Titicaca's levels have risen dramatically in the past, flooding valleys and swallowing settlements. But instead of transforming the narrative, these discoveries have remained on the margins, acknowledged yet not fully embraced. Why? Perhaps because they resist neat explanation, demanding we accept that history is less complete than we imagine, that silence hides truths not easily absorbed into conventional timelines. And this brings us to the heart of the question. What if Atlantis is not a city, but a metaphor for this very process? The Atlantis of the Andes may not be a single drowned settlement beneath Titicaca, but the recurring pattern of civilizations erased, their knowledge lost, their memory silenced. The ruins, myths, and waters together form a testimony that forgetting is not an exception, but a constant. What we call history is only the surface reflection. Beneath it lies a submerged realm of memory that we cannot fully recover. The Incas understood the power of memory and shaped it to serve their empire. They declared the island of the sun as their origin, recasting Titicaca as the cradle of their divine ancestry. In doing so, they absorbed older traditions into their own narrative, erasing while preserving. The Spanish, too, reshaped the myths, interpreting Viracocha as a shadow of the Christian God and discarding what did not fit their theology. In both cases, memory was rewritten, fragments submerged beneath new layers of meaning. The silence of Titicaca, then, is not accidental but engineered, a product of conquest, appropriation, and the deliberate control of narrative. Yet even silence speaks. The gate of the sun, with its deity figure and winged attendants, still gazes outward, demanding interpretation. The scattered H-blocks of Puma Punku resist dismissal, their sharp lines challenging explanations of primitive tools. The submerged ruins continue to sleep beneath the waters, surfacing only in whispers of divers and fishermen. These fragments remind us that erasure is never complete, that something always lingers, waiting. Silence, in this sense, is not absence, but presence hidden, memory submerged but alive. To walk along the shores of Titicaca is to feel this presence pressing through the stillness. The wind carries fragments of myth, the water conceals hints of stone, the stars reflect themselves in the surface, as though to remind us that earth and sky are one. Here, history does not end, but folds into mystery, forcing us to accept incompleteness. We are not meant to solve the riddle fully, but to recognize its weight, to acknowledge that what we have lost may be greater than what we have preserved. Perhaps this is the true meaning of the Atlantis of the Andes, not the promise of a city to be found, but the recognition of loss itself. Civilizations rise, carve knowledge into stone, map the heavens, and then vanish, leaving behind fragments that unsettle rather than resolve. The myth of Atlantis persists not because it promises discovery, but because it speaks to this universal truth, that forgetting is part of the human story, that silence is as enduring as memory. As the dawn brightens into morning, Titicaca glimmers with silver light. Boats move slowly across its surface, carrying villagers who live as their ancestors did, bound to the rhythms of lake and land. Life continues, resilient, even as the ruins whisper of worlds lost. The water reflects the mountains and the sky, yet conceals what lies beneath, reminding us that visibility is not truth. What we see is only part of the story. What we cannot see may be far larger, and so the silence of Titicaca remains, vast and immovable, a mirror of the cosmos above and the forgotten worlds below. It does not give answers, but it demands reflection. It compels us to ask how much of human history has been erased, How many civilizations lie drowned in silence, how fragile memory truly is. And in asking, we confront not only the past but ourselves, for we too are fragile, and one day our knowledge will join the ruins beneath the waters of time. The late afternoon shadows stretch across the altiplano, long fingers of darkness reaching toward the still waters of Lake Titicaca. The lake itself glows with a muted brilliance, catching the last light of the sun before night begins its slow ascent. In this suspended moment, when the world feels balanced between clarity and obscurity, the ruins take on an even greater weight. Their silence becomes more insistent, pressing itself against the mind like a question that cannot be ignored. For the mystery of the Andes Atlantis is not just about what has been lost beneath the lake. It is about what remains unseen within ourselves, the fragile link between memory and forgetting. The ruins at Tiahuanaco and Puma Punku are more than stone. They are fragments of a world view. Every block, every carving, every alignment speaks to a people who understood their place in the cosmos, not as separate from nature, but as part of its rhythm. The orientation of temples to solstices, the carving of myth into gateways, the careful management of water through canals and channels, all of it points to a vision in which the sacred was not apart from the world, but embedded within it. These people carved their knowledge into matter, ensuring it could survive long after their voices were silenced. And yet, paradoxically, the meaning itself did not survive. The stones remain, but their voice is gone. This absence compels us to question what forces severed the thread of continuity so abruptly. Archaeologists offer explanations grounded in climate change, suggesting that prolonged droughts undermined Tiahuanacu's agricultural base, forcing its people to scatter. There is truth in this, for the terraces and canals depended on delicate balances of water and soil. But does drought alone explain why so little of their knowledge was carried forward? Why their achievements in stone, astronomy, and hydraulics were not preserved in unbroken tradition? Catastrophe may destroy lives, but silence of this depth feels like something more. A rupture not just of survival, but of memory. The myths echo this rupture with haunting clarity. In the story of Viracocha, humanity is destroyed by flood and remade anew. Giants are drowned, chaos is erased, order imposed, but the god departs, leaving only fragments of knowledge. The myth does not describe continuity, it describes interruption, the sudden breaking of a world. Whether interpreted as allegory or memory of real cataclysm, the theme remains the same. Knowledge is fragile, easily lost, given only to be withdrawn. And this fragility is reflected in the ruins themselves, which stand as testimony to a vision too great to vanish entirely, yet too fractured to remain whole. The reports of submerged ruins beneath Titicaca seem to confirm that catastrophe was not only myth but reality. Stone terraces, walls, and steps beneath the waters suggest settlements once thrived, where now fish and reeds drift. The 2000 announcement of a massive temple-like structure, stretching more than a kilometer beneath the lake, seemed to pull myth into the realm of evidence. But instead of rewriting history, the discovery was absorbed into silence, debated briefly, then set aside. Why? Perhaps because to embrace it would destabilize too much, forcing us to admit that memory preserved in myth may be truer than the linear accounts of written history. The silence of official narratives mirrors the silence of the lake. Conquerors and scholars alike have rewritten memory to serve power, reshaping myths and dismissing anomalies. The Incas absorbed Titicaca into their imperial story, declaring it their birthplace. The Spanish rebranded Viracocha as a shadow of their god, silencing the autonomy of indigenous cosmology. Modern institutions, cautious and skeptical, often choose to dismiss submerged ruins as natural formations or exaggerations rather than confront the disruptive possibility they represent. Each layer of control adds another veil until the truth is buried more deeply than the ruins themselves. And yet, silence is never perfect. The fragments that remain are too stubborn. The gateway of the sun still gazes outward, its carvings mocking our ignorance. The H-blocks of Puma Punku still lie scattered, their angles too precise to dissolve into explanation. The submerged terraces still sleep beneath Titicaca, waiting for those who dare to search. These remnants resist total erasure, carrying enough presence to haunt us. They remind us that forgetting is never absolute, that something always remains, even when deliberately buried. Perhaps that is the deeper meaning of the Atlantis of the Andes. It is not a single drowned city waiting to be rediscovered intact, but a metaphor for the way civilizations rise, break, and vanish, leaving behind fragments that unsettle the present. Atlantis is not only beneath the waters of Titicaca, but beneath every silence in history, every erased memory, every knowledge destroyed, every voice overwritten. To speak of Atlantis here is to acknowledge that forgotten is part of the human condition, that silence is as enduring as stone. The night comes quickly in the Andes. Stars ignite across the sky, mirrored perfectly in the black waters of the lake. For the people who once lived here, this mirroring was not metaphor but reality. The heavens were reflected in the lake, the earth was reflected in the sky, and humanity existed between these mirrors, fragile and impermanent. The myths of floods, of departing gods, of knowledge withdrawn are not only stories of the past, but warnings. They remind us that what we hold as secure, our history, our knowledge, our memory, is always subject to erasure. And so the silence of Titicaca becomes a teacher. It does not give answers, but it compels reflection. It forces us to ask what we have lost, what we have chosen to bury, and what truths remain submerged beneath the narratives we accept. The ruins, the myths, the waters, all are fragments of a larger story, one we cannot complete but cannot ignore. To stand here, between lake and sky, is to feel that story pressing in from all sides. The stones at Puma Punku, the gateway of the sun, the submerged temple beneath Titicaca, they are all parts of the same silence, a silence heavy with memory. Perhaps we will never recover the full city, the full truth. But perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the lesson of the Atlantis of the Andes is that what matters most is not possession of the past, but awareness of its fragility. The wind stirs the reeds, the stars shimmer in the water, and the silence deepens. It is not emptiness, but presence, a reminder that beneath every surface lies something larger, unseen, and enduring. The lake does not answer our questions, but it reflects them back to us, infinite and unresolved. And in that reflection lies its truth, that history is always incomplete, that memory is always fragile, and that silence is never empty. Night descends swiftly over the altiplano, a darkness so pure that it seems to erase the boundaries of the world. Lake Titicaca lies black and infinite, reflecting the stars as if it were another sky stretched upon the earth. In this quiet expanse, silence deepens into something almost tangible, and the ruins at its shores loom like ghosts caught between memory and forgetting. It is in this darkness, more than in daylight, that the mystery of the Andes Atlantis feels most alive, for silence itself becomes a voice, whispering of cities drowned and knowledge erased. The ruins of Tiahuanaco and Puma Punku have always inspired awe, but in the solitude of night they reveal another dimension. They are not just structures, but shadows of a lost order. Their stones lie in patterns too deliberate to be accidents, yet too fractured to be understood. Every sharp edge and every collapsed wall speaks of an intention that has been obscured. The gate of the sun, standing against the horizon, becomes a silhouette of forgotten meaning, its deity figure staring across centuries of silence. The H-blocks scattered across Puma Punku appear less like ruins of temples than like the scattered remains of a system broken mid-construction, as though catastrophe froze history in place. This sense of frozen memory raises a deeper question. What if the rupture that silenced Tiahuanaco was not a single event, but part of a cycle? Myths across cultures speak of ages destroyed and renewed, of humanity created, corrupted, and then erased. In the Andean tradition, Viracocha embodies this cycle. He brings knowledge, destroys the unworthy with flood, reshapes the world, then vanishes into the horizon. His myth is not one of permanence, but of impermanence. Knowledge is always provisional, always at risk of being withdrawn. The ruins reflect this truth. They show us that mastery existed, but they do not preserve how it was achieved. They are fragments, stripped of continuity, leaving us to wonder whether the silence is accident or design. Geology lends weight to the myths. The Andes are restless, their mountains shaped by tectonic violence, their valleys scarred by glacial retreat. Lake Titicaca itself has risen and fallen dramatically, flooding valleys and exposing salt flats. A sudden surge of water could have erased entire settlements, transforming human catastrophe into divine punishment in the myths that followed. When divers report terraces and walls beneath the lake, when archaeologists debate the temple complex announced in 2000, they are touching the edge of this rupture. They are glimpsing the fragments of a memory preserved in stone but drowned in water. Yet it is not only natural forces that erase. Human conquest has always been a deeper flood, one that drowns memory more thoroughly than water. The Incas wove Titicaca into their imperial cosmology, declaring its islands to be the birthplace of their lineage. In doing so, they absorbed older traditions, but only selectively, reshaping them to legitimize their rule. The Spanish, centuries later, stripped away even more, reducing Viracocha to a distorted anticipation of their god and dismissing the rest as pagan confusion. Each act of conquest imposed silence, erasing voices and replacing them with sanctioned narratives. The Atlantis of the Andes may be less a place than this process itself, the deliberate drowning of memory beneath the weight of power. Still, the silence is not complete. Fragments resist erasure. Oral traditions persist, telling of gods, floods, and drowned cities. The stones stand, their precision mocking the dismissals of skeptics. The submerged ruins remain, glimpsed but never fully revealed, as if the lake itself conspires to keep them hidden until humanity is ready to listen. These fragments create dissonance, a tension that unsettles the official story. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but a fractured manuscript. Pages missing, words smudged, meanings altered. To read it is to confront absence as much as presence. The silence of Titicaca is therefore not emptiness but fullness, a silence charged with what cannot be said. It is like the night sky mirrored in the lake, so full of stars that it becomes a paradox of presence disguised as void. Perhaps the true Atlantis is not a city at all, but this silence itself, the weight of what has been forgotten yet refuses to vanish. Atlantis is not only beneath the waters of the Andes, but within every absence in human history, every knowledge erased, every voice silenced. It is the pattern of forgetting, and the fragments are its reminder. To walk along the shore at night is to feel this truth press into the soul. The stars shimmer on the water, but beneath the reflection lies darkness, hiding what we cannot see. The reeds whisper as if carrying echoes from another age. The stones, cold and immovable, seem to radiate questions that no language can answer. The silence becomes a mirror, forcing us to confront not only the mysteries of the past, but our own impermanence. If civilizations as great as Tiahuanacu could vanish, what guarantee do we have that our own will endure? This is perhaps the most haunting lesson of the Atlantis of the Andes, that memory is fragile, that civilizations are transient, that silence is inevitable. The myths of Viracocha do not promise permanence. They warn of cycles, of knowledge gained and lost, of worlds remade. The ruins do not preserve continuity. They preserve rupture, frozen reminders of what has been severed. The lake does not reveal its secrets. It conceals them, reflecting only the surface while holding deeper truths in its depths. And yet in this concealment lies meaning. The silence forces us to listen differently, to see absence as a kind of presence. The myths, the ruins, the waters, they remind us that history is not only what we know, but also what we cannot know, that forgetting is as much a part of human destiny as remembering. Perhaps the Atlantis of the Andes is not meant to be solved but contemplated, a reminder that loss itself shapes who we are. The night grows colder, the stars brighter, the lake darker. The silence deepens, not as emptiness but as fullness too vast for words. To stand here is to feel the weight of that silence pressing inward, to sense that beneath the waters lies not only stone, but memory itself, waiting in shadows, never gone, never wholly revealed. And in that awareness lies the truth the ruins whisper, that history is always incomplete, that silence is never empty, and that the Atlantis of the Andes endures not as a city, but as a mirror, reflecting our fragility, our impermanence, and the haunting persistence of what has been forgotten. The morning light spreads thin across the high plateau, a pale illumination that does not warm but reveals. Lake Titicaca gleams softly beneath the sky, its surface smooth, almost deceptive in its serenity. To look at it in this hour is to feel a contradiction. It seems eternal, yet within its depths lie traces of what is no longer here. The silence of the lake is not passive. It is active, holding something back, concealing fragments of a past that was never meant to vanish so completely. The ruins nearby, weathered but immovable, amplify that silence. They remind us again that the Atlantis of the Andes is not merely a legend but a wound in history, a rupture that never closed. The ruins of Puma Punku, scattered like fragments of a broken vision, remain among the most confounding. Blocks of stone weighing more than 100 tons lie as though they were cast aside by a hand larger than humanity. Their precision, their interlocking shapes, the sense of design so exact that it borders on mechanical. All of it defies the assumption that these were simply ceremonial constructions. If they were ritual sites, then the rituals they served demanded an engineering sophistication that feels far beyond necessity. Why cut such stones with angles so exact? Why design blocks that appear as modular components? If their purpose was symbolic, then the symbolism was carved with the language of mathematics and geometry. The gate of the sun deepens the mystery. Its deity figure, often interpreted as Viracocha, stands at its center, arms outstretched, surrounded by beings whose wings and postures suggest a hierarchy we cannot fully decipher. Some scholars have suggested that the carvings form a calendar, a mapping of solar cycles that may have tracked centuries. Others see in it a mythological tableau, a story of creation and destruction preserved in stone. But regardless of interpretation, the gate embodies one haunting truth. It speaks a language we no longer understand. The figures are visible, the carvings precise, but the voice has been silenced. The gate stands not only as a monument, but as a symbol of forgetting. The myths of Viracocha preserve fragments of this forgotten language. He emerges from Lake Titicaca after a flood, brings order, teaches arts and agriculture, then departs across the horizon. His story is one of rupture, not permanence. Knowledge is given but then withdrawn. Civilization rises but then falls. Memory is preserved but only in fragments. The myth mirrors the ruins themselves. Both testify to greatness, yet both testify also to silence. Perhaps the most unsettling feature of Viracocha is his absence, his departure, his refusal to remain. It is as if the myths themselves are telling us that forgetting is inevitable, that loss is woven into the very fabric of history. Geological evidence reinforces these themes. Studies of Titicaca show dramatic fluctuations in its water levels over millennia. Entire valleys were once fertile, only to be drowned as the lake expanded. Glacial melts, tectonic shifts, and climate cycles combined to reshape the landscape. A sudden flood could have erased settlements, leaving survivors to remember in the form of myth. When divers report terraces, walls, and temple-like structures beneath the lake, they are not only finding ruins, they are finding the shadows of myths made real. The drowned cities of oral tradition are not mere imagination. They are fragments of memory encoded in story, confirmed in stone. Yet the silence around these discoveries persists. When a vast submerged structure was reported in 2000, described as a temple complex stretching for over a kilometer, the announcement stirred interest briefly before fading into obscurity. The discovery should have altered the narrative of Andean history, but instead it was absorbed into silence, treated as anomaly rather than revelation. Why? Perhaps because the acknowledgement would destabilize the official story, forcing us to admit that history is incomplete, that myth may hold truths that academia is reluctant to embrace. The silence, once again, becomes more than absence. It becomes a deliberate choice. This deliberate silence echoes the patterns of conquest. The Incas appropriated Titicaca into their mythology, declaring its islands sacred, the birthplace of their divine ancestors. The Spanish followed, dismantling temples and recasting myths in Christian terms. Both conquests rewrote memory, stripping away original meanings and replacing them with narratives of power. What remains is not clarity, but distortion, not continuity, but fracture. If Atlantis exists here, it is as much in the act of forgetting as in the act of drowning. The Atlantis of the Andes may not be a single city beneath the lake, but the accumulation of erasures, the deliberate submerging of memory beneath the tides of empire. And still fragments resist. The precision of Puma Punku, the carvings of the gateway of the sun, the submerged terraces glimpsed by divers. These are remnants too stubborn to vanish, echoes too loud to be silenced entirely. They remind us that forgetting is never perfect, that memory lingers in fragments, haunting us with questions we cannot answer. They are the voices of silence itself, compelling us to listen not for what is said, but for what is withheld. To walk along the shores of Titicaca is to enter into this tension between presence and absence. The lake reflects the sky, showing us everything above, yet conceals everything below. It is both mirror and veil, revelation and concealment. The ruins reinforce this paradox. They show us mastery of stone, but withhold the knowledge behind it. The myths deepen it further, telling us of gods and floods, but refusing to give us clarity. In all of this, the Atlantis of the Andes emerges not as a city to be rediscovered intact, but as a silence that demands reflection. Perhaps that is the truest gift of Titicaca's mystery. It does not resolve, it unsettles. It reminds us that civilizations rise and vanish, that knowledge is fragile, that memory is easily broken. The myth of Atlantis resonates here not because it promises discovery, but because it acknowledges loss. The lake does not tell us what lies beneath. It tells us that something is hidden, something larger than we can grasp. And that knowledge, the knowledge of our own ignorance, may be the most important truth of all. The morning brightens, the sun climbs higher, and the silver surface of Titicaca sparkles with deceptive serenity. Boats move across the water, their paths ancient, their rhythms unbroken by the centuries. Life continues, fragile yet enduring, even as the ruins whisper of worlds long vanished. The silence remains heavy, yet within it lies a strange consolation. Forgetting is never absolute. Something always survives. Stone, myth, fragment, silence itself. Perhaps this is what the Atlantis of the Andes truly is. Not a city waiting to be uncovered, but a mirror reminding us of fragility, of impermanence, of the inevitability of loss. The lake reflects the sky, the ruins reflect forgotten knowledge, and the silence reflects ourselves. To listen to that silence is to hear the echo of what was drowned, the voice of what was erased, the haunting truth that forgetting is as eternal as remembering. The evening mist drifts slowly over Lake Titicaca, softening the outlines of mountains and reeds until the world appears blurred, half-remembered, half-erased. The water takes on the color of lead, and its surface ripples as if stirred by unseen hands. To witness this quiet transformation is to feel the weight of history pressing through the silence. The lake does not need to reveal its secrets to remind us that they exist. Its very stillness is enough, a mirror that reflects not only the sky, but also the absence of voices long drowned. The ruins along its shores become silhouettes in the fading light, their silence heavier now than in the glare of day. The ruins of Tiahuanaco remain at the center of this silence, their stones speaking in a language no one can fully translate. The vast monoliths of Kalasasaya, the intricate carvings of the gateway of the sun, the scattered precision blocks of Puma Punku. Together they present a vision of mastery that resists containment within conventional timelines. Archaeologists categorize them as the product of the Tiahuanaco culture, which flourished from the 5th to the 10th century. Yet the scale of these achievements, their astronomical alignments, and their sheer ambition suggest something larger, something older, perhaps knowledge inherited from an age now erased. The ruins do not confirm answers, they deepen questions, reminding us that absence is as much a part of history as presence. The myths that survive in Aymara and Quechua traditions amplify this uncertainty. They speak of Viracocha, the great creator, who brought order after chaos, shaped humanity after flood, and then departed into the horizon. His story is one of rupture and withdrawal, of knowledge given and then taken away. The myths describe floods that drowned giants, disasters that reset humanity, and gods who intervened only to vanish. These are not tales of gradual progress, but of cycles of erasure and renewal. And in their rhythm, they mirror the geological truths of the Andes. The lake's levels have risen and fallen violently, swallowing valleys, erasing settlements, and reshaping landscapes. Catastrophes such as these would be remembered not as geology, but as divine intervention, encoded in story for generations. When divers in the 20th century began to report terraces, steps, and walls beneath Titicaca's surface, myth and geology converged with startling clarity. The announcement in 2000 of a vast submerged structure, a temple-like complex stretching over a kilometer, seemed to validate centuries of oral tradition. Yet instead of rewriting history, the discovery was absorbed into silence, debated briefly, and then allowed to fade. Was this reluctance born of caution, or of fear that acknowledging such ruins would unravel too many assumptions? The silence of institutions mirrors the silence of the lake itself. It conceals as much as it reveals, preserving absence as if it were safer than truth. The Incas understood the power of narrative, and they claimed Titicaca for their own, weaving it into their imperial mythology. They declared the island of the sun as the birthplace of their divine ancestors, appropriating its sanctity to legitimize their rule. The Spanish, too, rebranded the myths, stripping Viracocha of his complexity and forcing him into the mold of their theology. In both cases, memory was rewritten, not preserved. The Atlantis of the Andes may therefore be less a physical city than a process, the deliberate erasure of voices, the silencing of traditions, the drowning of truths beneath layers of conquest and control. And yet, fragments resist. The blocks of Puma Punku remain, their precision mocking dismissals. The gateway of the sun endures, its deity still gazing outward with mute authority. Oral traditions survive among the Aymara and Quechua, repeating stories of gods, floods, and vanished peoples. The submerged ruins, whether or not they are ever fully mapped, lie waiting beneath the lake, testimony to a memory too heavy to dissolve entirely. These fragments do not form a complete picture, but they form a resonance, a dissonance that unsettles the official story. They are voices speaking through silence, refusing to vanish. The persistence of these fragments forces us to reconsider what Atlantis truly means. Perhaps it is not a single city, lost and waiting to be found, but a metaphor for the fragility of memory. Perhaps the Atlantis of the Andes is not one drowned settlement, but the accumulation of all that has been erased by flood, by conquest, by silence. It is the recognition that what we call history is only a fraction of what has existed, that forgetting is as constant as remembering, that civilizations vanish not only physically, but narratively. Atlantis here is the reminder that absence is as enduring as presence. To stand at Titicaca's edge in the evening mist is to feel this truth settle into the body. The lake is vast and still, reflecting the stars soon to emerge. The ruins loom dark, their shapes softened yet defiant. The silence is not emptiness, but presence, pressing in with the weight of all that cannot be said. One senses that the drowned cities are not only beneath the waters, but within the silence itself, preserved not as structures to be excavated, but as questions too large to be contained. And in this awareness comes unease. If civilizations as great as Tiahuanacu could vanish, their knowledge drowned or silenced, what does that say about our own? If floods, earthquakes, and conquests could erase them, why should our continuity be more secure? The myths of Viracocha, the ruins of Puma Punku, the silence of Titicaca all seem to whisper the same warning. Permanence is an illusion. Memory is fragile, and silence is inevitable. Yet within this inevitability lies a paradoxical hope. For silence, though it erases, never erases completely. Fragments always remain. Myths survive. Stones endure. Ruins resist. Even drowned beneath waters, memory persists in echoes, waiting for those willing to listen differently. Perhaps this is the meaning of the Atlantis of the Andes. Not the promise of rediscovery, but the reminder that even forgetting cannot be absolute. That traces of the lost always survive to unsettle the present. The mist thickens, the lake darkens, and the stars pierce the sky with cold brilliance. Titicaca mirrors them perfectly, as though the universe itself were doubled. In this reflection lies the essence of the mystery. Above us is the cosmos, below us is the abyss, and between them humanity struggles, fragile, transient, always building and always forgetting. The ruins whisper of what has been lost, the myths remind us of cycles of erasure, and the silence presses in as a presence too vast to ignore. The Atlantis of the Andes is not gone. It is here, in the silence itself, haunting, unresolved, eternal. The final shadows of dusk fall across Lake Titicaca, and the air grows thin and cold as though the night itself were inhaling the last warmth of the sun. The lake darkens into a vast mirror of obsidian, reflecting the stars as if they were not above but within the waters themselves. The mountains loom as black silhouettes against a horizon fading into indigo, and the ruins on the altiplano become spectral outlines, caught halfway between matter and memory. It is here, at this hour, that the Atlantis of the Andes feels most present, not as a city to be uncovered, but as a silence that cannot be dispelled. The myths of Viracocha whisper through the silence, telling of floods that drowned giants, of creation born from water, of knowledge given and then withdrawn. These stories do not resolve into certainty. They echo instead with the cadence of rupture, reminding us that civilizations are fragile, that memory is precarious. The ruins confirm this rhythm. The stones of Puma Punku remain scattered as though frozen in a moment of sudden catastrophe. The gateway of the sun still gazes outward, its deity carved in silent proclamation, its meaning withheld. The submerged ruins of Titicaca continue to sleep beneath the waters, their presence confirmed, yet their story obscured. Together, myth, ruin, and silence weave a tapestry of absence that resists erasure. This absence is not emptiness. It is a fullness too great for words, a presence that overwhelms by refusing clarity. To search for Atlantis here is not to find a city, but to confront the inevitability of forgetting. The Atlantis of the Andes is not only beneath the waters, it is in the fracture of continuity, the silence imposed by catastrophe, the rewriting of memory by empires. It is in the way history itself bends under the weight of power, discarding voices that do not fit its design. Every submerged wall, every myth of flood, every silenced story testifies not to absence, but to the persistence of what refuses to vanish entirely. Perhaps this is why the myth of Atlantis resonates so powerfully across cultures. It is less a story of a single place and more a reflection of a universal truth. Civilizations rise, flourish, and vanish, leaving behind fragments that resist erasure. The myth survives because it speaks to what we know in our bones, that permanence is an illusion, that memory is fragile, that silence is inevitable. To call Titicaca the Atlantis of the Andes is to recognize that its silence is part of a larger pattern, one in which humanity itself is always precarious, always standing at the edge of forgetting. The Incas understood this, though they reshaped it to their own ends. By declaring the island of the sun as their birthplace, they absorbed older truths into their imperial myth. The Spanish, too, recognized the power of memory and silenced it, reducing Viracocha to a distorted anticipation of their god. In both cases, Atlantis was not destroyed but rewritten, drowned beneath new narratives that preserved fragments while erasing their original voice. What remains now is not a single clear story, but a palimpsest of interpretations layered one atop another, each obscuring and preserving in equal measure. Yet despite these layers, fragments remain. The stones of Puma Punku, the carvings on the gateway of the sun, the terraces beneath Titicaca's waters. They are too stubborn to vanish, too heavy to dissolve into silence. They resist not only time, but erasure, bearing witness to the persistence of memory even when its meaning is lost. They remind us that forgetting is never absolute, that something always survives to unsettle the present. The Atlantis of the Andes, then, is not a promise of discovery, but a reminder of the fragments that endure, fragments that speak without words. To walk along the lake's edge in this final hour of twilight is to feel the weight of this truth. The air is thin, the stars sharpen overhead, and the water reflects both sky and silence. The ruins stand as shadows, but their presence is undeniable. One senses that the true Atlantis is not beneath the water, but within the silence itself, in the recognition that history is always incomplete, always fractured, always vulnerable to erasure. The ruins do not explain themselves, the myths do not resolve, and the lake does not reveal. But together they create a resonance that cannot be ignored. This resonance is what haunts us. It compels us to ask not only what was lost at Titicaca, but what will be lost of our own civilizations. If Tiahuanacu, with its mastery of stone and sky, could vanish, what assurance do we have that our knowledge will endure? If floods and conquests could drown memory so thoroughly here, what floods, natural or human, wait for us? The silence of Titicaca is not only about the past, it is a mirror held to the present, reflecting our fragility, reminding us of the inevitability of forgetting. And yet, within this inevitability lies a paradoxical hope. For silence, though it erases, never erases completely. Myths survive in fragments, stones endure in defiance, ruins persist in shadows. Even drowned beneath waters, memory lingers, waiting for those willing to listen differently. Perhaps the true lesson of the Atlantis of the Andes is not that a city will one day be rediscovered intact, but that fragments are enough. They are enough to remind us of what has been lost, enough to unsettle our certainties, enough to keep alive the awareness that history is more than what we know. Night has now taken the lake entirely. The stars shimmer on its black surface, infinite and unbroken, as though the cosmos itself were doubled. The ruins are swallowed into shadow, but their presence is felt even in the dark. The silence deepens, pressing in from all sides, not as emptiness, but as a fullness too vast for words. To stand here is to confront that silence, to recognize it as the true Atlantis, not a city, not a myth, but the weight of forgetting itself. And in that recognition lies the most haunting truth of all, that what has been drowned is never truly gone, that silence itself is memory in another form, and that beneath the surface of every history lies an ocean of absence waiting to be acknowledged.